Thank you so much, Sable. It is so exciting to be here as a part of Writers Conduit, and especially to participate in believable world building.
If some of this is if you guys have questions or I'm going too fast, please let me know. I tend to talk very quickly.
What made you want to write for kids? This is kind of the icebreaker.
So today what we're going to be covering is we're going to be talking about who can critique and kind of what are the different types of critiquers who are in the world around us.
So, for example, this is Pelagia, homeworld of the Sky Rays.
I've been doing creative writing workshops here where I live for a long time. It's always been this kind of format where you set a timer, write whatever based on the prompt, and then go around open mic and just kind of read what we wrote.
So we're talking about cover art today. Cover art can attract readers or repel them. As much as we like to think people won't judge a book by its cover, we know it's true.
As far as I can tell, the best definition of what neurodiversity is any form of differentiation in brain function.
We are here to discuss NaNoWriMo, National Novel Writing Month.
This is the traditional versus independent publishing panel.
I'm really into the academic side of mythology as well as the more fun storytelling side.
When you hit somebody, it makes a distinct sound. If you hit them in a certain place, it makes a distinct sound.
Welcome to Writers Conduit, finding your online community.
Thank you so much, Sable. It is so exciting to be here as a part of Writers Conduit, and especially to participate in believable world building.
If some of this is if you guys have questions or I'm going too fast, please let me know. I tend to talk very quickly.
What made you want to write for kids? This is kind of the icebreaker.
So today what we're going to be covering is we're going to be talking about who can critique and kind of what are the different types of critiquers who are in the world around us.
So, for example, this is Pelagia, homeworld of the Sky Rays.
I've been doing creative writing workshops here where I live for a long time. It's always been this kind of format where you set a timer, write whatever based on the prompt, and then go around open mic and just kind of read what we wrote.
So we're talking about cover art today. Cover art can attract readers or repel them. As much as we like to think people won't judge a book by its cover, we know it's true.
As far as I can tell, the best definition of what neurodiversity is any form of differentiation in brain function.
We are here to discuss NaNoWriMo, National Novel Writing Month.
This is the traditional versus independent publishing panel.
I'm really into the academic side of mythology as well as the more fun storytelling side.
When you hit somebody, it makes a distinct sound. If you hit them in a certain place, it makes a distinct sound.
Welcome to Writers Conduit, finding your online community.
Thank you so much, Sable. It is so exciting to be here as a part of Writers Conduit, and especially to participate in believable world building.
If some of this is if you guys have questions or I'm going too fast, please let me know. I tend to talk very quickly.
What made you want to write for kids? This is kind of the icebreaker.
So today what we're going to be covering is we're going to be talking about who can critique and kind of what are the different types of critiquers who are in the world around us.
So, for example, this is Pelagia, homeworld of the Sky Rays.
I've been doing creative writing workshops here where I live for a long time. It's always been this kind of format where you set a timer, write whatever based on the prompt, and then go around open mic and just kind of read what we wrote.
So we're talking about cover art today. Cover art can attract readers or repel them. As much as we like to think people won't judge a book by its cover, we know it's true.
As far as I can tell, the best definition of what neurodiversity is any form of differentiation in brain function.
We are here to discuss NaNoWriMo, National Non-Writing Month.
This is the traditional independent publishing panel.
I'm really into the archetype of mythology as well as the more fun storytelling side.
When you hit somebody, it makes a distinct sound. If you hit them in a certain place, it makes a distinct sound.
Welcome to Writers Conduit, finding your online community.
Thank you much, Sable. It is so exciting to be here as a part of Writers Conduit, and especially to participate in believable world building.
If some of this, if you guys have questions or going, please let me know. I can directly.
What made it right for kids? This is kind of the icebreaker.
So today covering is talking about who can kind of what types of critiquers around us.
For example, Pelagia, homeworld of the Sky Rays.
I've been doing creative writing workshops here where I live for a long time. It's always been this kind of format where you set a timer, write whatever based on the prompt, and then go around open mic and just kind of read what we wrote.
So we're talking about cover art today. Cover art can attract readers or repel them. As much as we like to think people won't judge a book by its cover, we know it's true.
As far as I can tell, the best definition of what neurodiversity is any form of differentiation in brain function.
We are here to discuss NaNoWriMo, National Non-Writing Month.
This is the traditional versus independent publishing panel.
I'm really into the academic side of mythology as well as the more fun storytelling side.
When you hit somebody, it makes a sound. If you hit them in a certain place, it makes a distinct sound.
Welcome to Writers Conduit, finding your online community.
Thank you so much, Sable. It is so exciting to be here as a part of Writers Conduit, and especially to participate in believable world building.
If some of this is a little, if you guys have questions or I'm going too fast, please let me know. I can talk very quickly.
What want to write for kids? This is kind of the icebreaker.
So today what we're covering is we're going to be talking about who critique and kind of what are the different types of critiquers who are in the world around us.
So, this is Pelagia, homeworld of the Sky Rays.
I've been doing creative writing workshops where I live for a long time. It's always been this kind of format where you set a timer, write whatever based on the prompt, and then round open mic and just kind of read what we wrote.
So we're talking about cover art today. Cover art can attract readers or repel them. As much as we like to think people won't judge a book by its cover, we know it's true.
As far as I can tell, the best definition of what neurodiversity is any form of differentiation in brain function.
We are here to discuss NaNoWriMo, National Novel Writing Month.
This is the traditional versus independent publishing panel.
I'm really into the academic side of mythology as well as the more fun storytelling side.
When you hit somebody, it makes a distinct sound. If you hit them in a certain place, it makes a distinct sound.
Welcome to Writers Conduit, finding your online community.
Thank you so much, Sable. It is so exciting to be here as a part of Writers Conduit, and especially to participate in believable world building.
If some of this is a little, if you guys have questions or I'm going too fast, please let me know. I tend to talk very quickly.
What made you want to write for kids? This is kind of an icebreaker.
So today what we're going to be covering is we're going to be talking about who can critique and kind of what are the different types of critiquers who are in the world around us.
So, for example, this is Pelagia, homeworld of the Sky Rays.
I've been doing creative writing workshops here where I live for a long time. It's always been this kind of format where you set a time, write whatever based on the go around, open mic, and just kind of read what we wrote.
So we're talking about cover art today. Cover art can attract readers or repel them. As much as we like to think people won't judge a book by its cover, we know it's true.
As far as I can tell, the best definition of what neurodiversity is any form of differentiation in brain function.
We are here to discuss NaNoWriMo, National Novel Writing Month.
This is the traditional versus independent publishing panel.
I'm really into the academic side of mythology as well as the more fun storytelling side.
With somebody, it makes a distinct sound. If you hit them in a certain place, it makes a distinct sound.
Welcome to Writers Conduit, finding your online community.
Thank you so much, Sable. It is so exciting to be here as a part of Writers Conduit, and especially to participate in believable world building.
If some of this is a little, if you guys have questions or I'm going too fast, please let me know. I tend to talk very quickly.
What made you want for kids? This is kind of an icebreaker.
So today what we're going to be covering is we're going to be talking about who can critique and kind of the different types of critiquers who are in the world around us.
So, for example, this is homeworld of the Sky Rays.
I've been doing creative writing workshops here where I live for a long time. It's always been this kind of format where you set a timer, write whatever based on the prompt, and go around, open mic, and just kind of read what we wrote.
So we're talking about cover today. Cover art can attract readers or repel them. As much as we like to think people won't judge its cover, we know it's true.
As far as I can tell, the best definition of what neurodiversity is any form of differentiation in function.
We are here to discuss
the traditional versus independent publishing panel.
I'm really into the academic side of mythology as well as the more fun storytelling side.
When you hit C, it makes a distinct sound. If you hit them in a certain place, it makes a distinct sound.
Welcome to Writers Conduit, finding your online community.
Thank you so much. So exciting to be here as a part of Writers Conduit and actually to participate in believable world building.
If some of this is a little questions going too fast, please let me know. I can talk.
What made you write for kids?
So today what we're going to be doing is we're going to be talking about who critique and kind of what different in the world around us.
So, for example, this is a homeworld guide.
I've been doing creative writing workshops where I live for a long time. It's always been this kind of format where you set a timer, write whatever based on the prompt, and go around open mic and just kind of read what we wrote.
So we're talking about cover art. Cover art can attract readers or repel them. As much as we like people won't judge its cover, it's true.
As far as I can tell, the best definition of what neurodiversity is any form of differentiation brain function.
We are here to discuss NaNoWriMo, National Novel Writing.
This is the traditional versus independent publishing panel.
I'm really in the academic side of mythology as well as the more fun storytelling side.
When you hit somebody, it makes a distinct sound. If you hit them, it makes a distinct sound.
Welcome to Writers Conduit, finding your online community.
Thank you so much, Sable. It is so exciting to be here as a part of Writers Conduit and especially to participate in believable world building.
If some of this is a little, if you guys have questions or I'm going too fast, please let me know. I can talk very quickly.
What made you want to write for kids? So this is kind of the inspiration.
So today what we're going to be covering is we're going to be talking about who can critique and kind of what are the different types of critiquers who are in the world around us.
So, for example, this is Pelagia, homeworld of the Sky Rays.
I've been doing creative writing workshops here where I live for a long time. It's always been this kind of format where you set a timer, write whatever based on the prompt, and go around open mic and just kind of read what we wrote.
So we're talking about cover art today. Cover art can attract readers or repel them. As much as we like to think people won't judge a book by its cover, we know it's true.
As far as I can tell, the best definition of what neurodiversity is any form of differentiation in brain function.
We are here to discuss NaNoWriMo, National Novel Writing Month.
This is the traditional versus independent publishing panel.
I'm really into the academic side of mythology as well as the more fun storytelling side.
When you hit somebody, it makes a distinct sound. If you hit them in a certain place, it makes a distinct sound.
Welcome to Writers Conduit, finding your online community.
Thank you so much, Sable. It is so exciting to be here as a part of Writers Conduit, and especially to participate in believable world building.
If some of this is if you guys have questions or I'm going too fast, please let me know. I tend to talk very quickly.
What made you want to write for kids? So this is kind of the icebreaker.
So today what we're going to be covering is we're going to be talking about who can critique and kind of what are the different types of critiquers who are in the world around us.
So, for example, this is Pelagia, homeworld of the Sky Rays.
I've been doing creative writing workshops here where I live for a long time. It's always been this kind of format where you set a timer, write whatever based on the prompt, and then go around open mic and just kind of read what we wrote.
So we're talking about cover art today. Cover art can attract readers or repel them. As much as we like to think people won't judge a book by its cover, we know it's true.
As far as I can tell, the best definition of what neurodiversity is any form of differentiation in brain function.
We are here to discuss NaNoWriMo, National Novel Writing Month.
This is the traditional versus independent publishing panel.
I'm really into the academic side of mythology as well as the more fun storytelling side.
When you hit somebody, it makes a distinct sound. If you hit them in a certain place, it makes a distinct sound.
Welcome to Writers Conduit, finding your online community.
Thank you so much, Sable. It is so exciting to be here as a part of Writers Conduit, and especially to participate in believable world building.
If some of this is if you guys have questions or I'm going too fast, please let me know. I tend to talk very quickly.
What made you want to write for kids? So this is kind of the icebreaker.
So today what we're going to be covering is we're going to be talking about who can critique and kind of what are the different types of critiquers who are in the world around us.
So, for example, this is Pelagia, homeworld of the Sky Rays.
I've been doing creative writing workshops here where I live for a long time. It's always been this kind of format where you set a timer, write whatever based on the prompt, and then go around open mic and just kind of read what we wrote.
So we're talking about cover art today. Cover art can attract readers or repel them. As much as we like to think people won't judge a book by its cover, we know it's true.
As far as I can tell, the best definition of what neurodiversity is any form of differentiation in brain function.
We are here to discuss NaNoWriMo, National Novel Writing Month.
This is the traditional versus independent publishing panel.
I'm really into the academic side of mythology as well as the more fun storytelling side.
When you hit somebody, it makes a distinct sound. If you hit them in a certain place, it makes a distinct sound.
Welcome to Writers Conduit, finding your online community.
Thank you so much, Sable. It is so exciting to be here as a part of Writers Conduit, and especially to participate in believable world building.
If some of this is if you guys have questions or I'm going too fast, please let me know. I tend to talk very quickly.
What made you want to write for kids? So this is kind of the icebreaker.
So So today what we're going to be covering is we're going to be talking about who can critique and kind of what are the different types of critiquers who are in the world around us.
So, for example, this is Pelagia, homeworld of the Sky Rays.
I've been doing creative writing workshops here and where I live for a long time. It's always been this kind of format where you set a timer, write whatever based on the prompt, and then go around open mic and just kind of read what we wrote.
So we're talking about cover art today. Cover art can attract readers or repel them. As much as we like to think people won't judge a book by its cover, we know it's true.
As far as I can tell, the best definition of what neurodiversity is any form of differentiation in brain function.
We are here to discuss NaNoWriMo, National Novel Writing Month.
This is the traditional versus independent publishing panel.
I'm really into the academic side of mythology as well as the more fun storytelling side.
When you hit somebody, it makes a distinct sound. If you hit them in a certain place, it makes a distinct sound.
Welcome to Writer's Conduit, finding your online community.
Thank you so much, Sable. It is so exciting to be here as a part of Writers Conduit, and especially to participate in believable world building.
If some of this is a little, if you guys have questions or I'm going too fast, please let me know. I tend to talk very quickly.
What made you want to write for kids? So this is kind of the inspiration.
So today what we're going to be covering is we're going to be talking about who can critique and kind of what are the different types of critiquers who are in the world around us.
So, for example, this is Pelagia, homeworld of the Sky Rays.
I've been doing creative writing workshops here and where I live for a long time. It's always been this kind of format where you set a timer, write whatever based on the prompt, and then go around open mic and just kind of read what we wrote.
So we're talking about cover art today. Cover art can attract readers or repel them. As much as we like to think people won't judge a book by its cover, we know it's true.
As far as I can tell, the best definition of what neurodiversity is any form of differentiation in brain function.
We are here to discuss NaNoWriMo, National Novel Writing Month.
This is the traditional versus independent publishing panel.
I'm really into the academic side of mythology as well as the more fun storytelling side.
When you hit somebody, it makes a distinct sound. If you hit them in a certain place, it makes a distinct sound.
Welcome to Writer's Conduit, finding your online community.
Thank you so much, Sable. It is so exciting to be here.
But I can't hear you now, Kenyatta.
Alrighty, let's see.
As soon as Deanne Lee gets back, that's what I was saying. As soon as Deanne Lee gets back and she's got her sound fixed, we're good to go. Because William's not going to be able to make it because I forgot he's moving around. So he's way out of time sync. So I'm like, I'm not even going to, make a big deal about it. So yeah, as soon as she gets back, we can get started. But it's going to be pretty straightforward. I'm going to introduce myself, talk about the panel, those sorts of things, and then you all can introduce yourselves, and then I'll probably run through kind of like a bit of a talk about how science can shape writing. Dan is back. Okay. I guess I can start from here. Good morning, evening, afternoon, everybody. My name is Kenyatta Adams. I am a writer. I'm unpublished, but I really love science. My background is in science. I have a master's in biology, in evolutionary biology, animal behavior, and I also have a background of BS in biology. And so, of course, I love writing and anything to do with it. I've loved that since I was a kid, as well as writing, reading, and science. That was pretty much my trifecta as a kid. So on that note, that's where I got the idea for this panel. So using science as a writing tool is it seems like an interesting conundrum, but it's actually not. Give me a second here. I'm trying to see if everything is set. We're waiting on one more panelist, but I'm going to continue on because we do have time constraints and, definitely don't want to hold people up. So I'm going to go ahead and let Dr. Ailu and Dr. Kovacs go ahead and introduce themselves while I see what's going on.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Mentawab Ayado, and I am an associate professor of biology at Spelman College. That's where Kenyatta went, and she roamed the hallways of our department for many years. Yes, and it was really a great pleasure to meet her, get to know her. And we knew back then that one of her biggest hobbies was actually reading. And I'm not surprised that now she's pulling this panel together. So thank you for the invitation, Kenyatta. And it's great
definitely.
To meet you again. And so I'm an associate professor of biology, and my area of expertise is in plant cellular and molecular biology. And specifically, I have been interested in understanding how plants respond to antibiotics, how they may have evolved traits for antibiotics. So back in the days when I was a postdoc, I discovered that plants had actually antibiotic resistance genes. And so that was really, really new way of thinking about plants, as organisms that might develop antibiotic resistance, because whenever we think about antibiotic resistance, we think of pathogenic bacteria, oftentimes in humans, that develop resistance to the antibiotic drugs that we take. And so it was surprising to know that plants had antibiotic resistance. And so ever since, we're looking into what is the associated mechanisms, does it work, how did it evolve, and so on. And lately, this research is starting to spill over into understanding the bacteria that produce the interaction of plants and the bacteria in the soil that might be producing some of these antibiotics. And so that's my research. And as usually as professors, we have like 3 hats. One is research, the other one is teaching, and another one is service. And so as part of service, I'm deeply involved into student mentoring, student development, and so on. And in terms of teaching, I teach anything from introductory biology, teaching about animals and plants, obviously, all the way to kind of specialty areas, research-based courses in my discipline. So kind of in a nutshell, I think that gives you a picture of my work at Spelman. I've been there since 2008, so I'm a veteran at Spelman.
Yep, definitely. Would you like to go ahead, Dr. Kovacs?
Sure. Hi, my name's Jen Kovacs. I am an associate professor of biology at Agnes Scott College. I think a lot like Kenyatta. I was like a voracious reader as a child. I don't get to. I have twins now, so I don't get to read as much. But I think like the thing that really hooked me, was I remember devouring like all of Dragon Riders of Pern when I was a kid. I think that was like the first thing. Like you couldn't get me out of the library. I was just in the corner reading those books, devouring it. I've rediscovered my love of Ursula K. Le Guin recently. There's a collection of her short stories, The Real and the Unreal, which is about like I can dedicate that much time to short stories, and those have been fantastic to reread. I also read, I just finished, I'm late to the party, but I finished the Southern Trilogy, the Vandermeer Annihilation, and that stuff was amazingly good. It was great, like the lead scientists, women characters speak to me, and that was a really great book, and I enjoyed it. And I'm almost done with The Three Body Problem, which is some hard sci-fi. I got the second one coming, and I'm really it's really good. A physicist friend of mine was like, you should read this. So yeah, when I find time, I do tend to read these are fantastic books. I remember when I was a kid, when Jurassic Park, the book came out, like it had just come out. A friend of mine's older sister gave it to me, and I absolutely loved it. And it's on my summer reread list. I think I read it every summer. Like it starts to get too hot, and I'm like, ooh, Jurassic Park, and we'll reread it. And I'm not Ellie Sadler, but I try, right? So I'm I'm an evolutionary ecologist, and that means that I kind of try to understand how organisms evolved and how their environment shapes them, and kind of how they make a living. My work really looks at a couple things. One of them that's pretty cool, and I think it is really science fiction sometimes, is this process of horizontal gene transfer. So I look a lot at insects. Insects are my jam. And horizontal gene transfer is when you get genes from somewhere that's not your parent. Right. So we think about it a lot, like what Matt was talking about with antibiotic resistance in plants. They're getting those genes from bacteria or from somewhere else. Right. Like, so bacteria swap genes a lot. We're kind of used to that, but we're not used to thinking about how other organisms get their genes sometimes. And most of the time we get it from our parents. But one of my students called it, insects getting superpowers. So, they can get these genes from bacteria, or they can get these genes from fungus, and they're functional sometimes, not all the time. Most of the time they're not, but sometimes they are. They're functional in their genome, and it lets them pick up a trait that they didn't have before. So, one of the things that I do study is aphids, and some aphids are pink and green, and it turns out that pink gene is actually a fungal gene from a fungus that they got, and now they can produce carotenoids, and now they're pink. And that actually plays a lot in their biology. Parasitic wasps don't like the pink ones. I don't know. It's like green M&Ms. But yeah, so it's we don't know why they don't like the pink ones, but they don't like the pink ones. So yeah, it's a really interesting way. And so a lot of my work is trying to identify those genes in a variety of arthropod species. More recently, I've started working with natural history collections to digitize them, mostly because I just want to get back in the collections and open up all the drawers and see all the weird stuff that they have. This is my childhood passion, right? This is really this is the Ellie Sadler. I'm not a paleontologist, but I want to go play in the paleontology collections, right? But the insect collections are just as fascinating. So I've been working with different museums to digitize their collections and to bring that work into the undergraduate classroom, especially for museums or for small colleges that don't have museums nearby. So we've been working a lot with that recently, and that's been a lot of fun. I think that's like really fulfilling my childhood dream of like, I just want to open up all the boxes and see all the weird things. So.
Oh, that's great to hear. Yeah. That sounds like a lot of fun.
It is a lot of fun.
All right. And Miss Danielle, Dr. Danielle Lee. Let's see. You want to go ahead and introduce yourself, or we're still not hearing?
I think there's a message to let the other DN Lee in because it's her sound. So she can hear the sound if you let her in the other way. So she
I see.
she's probably in the waiting room on under another Zoom name.
Gotcha. Her she says her other DN Lee has her sound. So she can't speak. But in the meantime, so I conceived this panel idea because one of the things that I noticed was that when people think about science and reading and writing, they're thinking hard sci-fi. They're thinking, that it's only sci-fi where you're going to see and utilize science, and that's not true. You utilize science in mysteries when people are solving mysteries. You've got forensics. You've got like the Patricia Collins series, which is a series of books following a medical examiner. You've got even in fantasy, you have these sort of situations that are very science-based, but people don't see them as such because we've come to associate science with sci-fi, and that's not necessarily the case, because sci-fi in and of itself is a genre because it's a genre that uses science and science advancements to talk about philosophical, sociological, psychological situations within humans in terms of our ideologies, our behaviors, and things like that. And science is the vector in which we talk about that. But because sci-fi has become associated with the lasers, the experimentation, and all those things, people don't necessarily see science in all of the works that they're working on or writing, and how it can be used to set up stories and conflicts and plots and things of that nature. So I was really wanting to set up this this panel so that not only could people learn more about utilizing science and how it can be utilized in writing, but also how it can be utilized in writing, as well as how it can shape how your characters are created, how your worlds work, and those sorts of things. Because sometimes I will be reading a story, having a great time, and then suddenly I'm like, wait, so you're telling me that we're going from A to M. Why? That doesn't make sense. Or they sort of hand wave their science away on something that can be really simply explained. So I was like, I want to get a panel together and bring in some people that I know that are good in their specialties so that people could ask questions if they had them. Because sometimes research, not everybody has a background in science. And, oh, so you want to go ahead and, okay. No, you're fine. You're fine. But yeah, so now I'm kind of giving you a run through, because basically that's what I'm going to do. Once Dr. Lee introduces herself, I'm going to run through a little talk, and then we can have you guys answer questions, or I have some questions I can ask the panelists, so it's all good. So Dr. Lee, would you like to go ahead and at least introduce yourself? Or does your other account have your mic as well? Okay.
Can you hear us now?
Can you hear us?
Yeah.
Okay. So you wanna so do you want to go ahead and introduce yourself?
Yes, I guess first testing.
Ooh.
There, testing. Is that better? Testing.
Yes.
There we go.
Yes.
Thank you so much. I appreciate your patience. So I'm Dr. Danielle Lee. I'm a biologist who studies ecology and mammalogy and animal behavior. I am an assistant professor at Southern Illinois University, Edwardsville in the St. Louis area. And I have the extreme pleasure and excitement of studying rodents, those of unusual size, really large ones, as well as little small ones that fit in your hand. I'm really interested in how nuisance rodents in particular, so the ones that give us trouble, how they've been so great at, persisting. Because I'm an ecologist, I study animals from their perspective. So I'm very, very interested in understanding how nature works, cataloging what's out there, and just understanding better how they make a living. That's really what I'm interested in. And I take the approach that humans are a part of the environment, not like extracted of it. And when I think of it that way, when I think about, not just these rodents making a living, both in nature and off of us, whether we think of ourselves as nature or we build up and modify habitats, it really makes me think about the fact that across all of humanity, the entire continuum. So before we even recognize ourselves in this particular state, but they're across time, across culture, across geography, all of humanity has dealt with nuisance rodents. And that's the part that really, I kind of think about it from that point of view. It's like, so they've always been there, probably going to always be here. So in understanding just what makes them so resilient. So I'm fascinated by that. I was a kid who spent a lot of time outside. So that's how I spent a lot of my outside time. I was an outside kid, spent time in parks, love being outside. And so when I discovered I could make a career out of watching animals for a living, I was like, sign me up for that. And that's when I started thinking about academia. As a child, I had a big imagination. For a long time, I was tricked into thinking I'd be an only child. So my parents started having younger siblings until I was much older. So I entertained myself a lot. I was that kid who did the summer book reading club. I just read everything. I can't tell you what all I didn't read. I really, really liked biographies as a kid. Like I was really into those like little reader trade books. They were old, because I'm convinced now my school library was just old. It was like all these little biographies that could fit in the palm of your hand. And I just love reading about like the life of these other young girls and women and the things that they grew up to do. And I think that inspired me thinking, well, hey, I can start from these humble beginnings and I can have this great grand story myself. And, imagining, like all those TV shows that I watch of Wild Kingdom. And then I got lucky and I've been able to do that. I was like, oh, so in my head, I'm like living one of those little stories in my head. I can be found on social media. So I talk about a lot of my science adventures and my science discoveries and even the things that I do in science, like the others, like I mentor students. I talk about how to make science spaces, particular spaces for students in trainees, more inclusive and welcoming and equitable. So as a college professor, so that's a little bit of everything that we do, a little bit of all of that.
Right. Thank you so much for those introductions. So then the next thing I would want to do is talk about how do we define science as a concept. Some Googling, while I was preparing for this, basically says one of three things. Science, the intellectual and practical activity encompassing the systematic study of structure and behavior of the physical and or natural world through observation and experiment. A second definition is a particular area of science, such as chemistry as a science, physics as a science, etc. And then there's a third one that I really kind of like when it comes to talking about writing. I'm sorry, is somebody trying to cut in or is that something? Okay. But particularly, I like the definition of a systemically organized body of knowledge on a particular subject. I like this definition, especially when it pertains to writing, because it's a much broader conversation that can be had about science and how you can think about science and use it when you are designing your worlds, writing your plot, developing your characters. Because I will tell you, right now. I am a world building fiend. I love it. I love character building. I love it all. And so like I have entire shelves literally in my room. I have shelves of books that are nothing but books that I bought particularly to study or to learn about a subject that I was planning on writing about. So I have no problem with going in and picking up books and thinking about these impacts that these sorts of things can have because I've been doing it my whole life. Because as I said in the beginning, when I introduced myself, I have had a love of science and writing and reading since I was a kid. So it all kind of blended together. One was not exclusive to the other. So the next thing would be, okay, so if science is this systematically organized body of knowledge on a particular subject, what does this have to do with writing? Lots of things, actually. So your world building, which is the obvious place most people go. You're thinking your Avatar: The Last Airbender. You're thinking about Star Trek and Altered Carbon and your medical dramas and your crime scene investigations and your Criminal Minds and all of those things when you're thinking about how to when you think about the use of science. But also you got the Avatar, and we're just talking about the blue ones, not Avatar: The Last Airbender, but the blue ones on Pandora, and the flora and fauna that made such a big impact to the story there as well. So yes, world building is pretty much the common way that it's utilized. But in terms of writing, there's more to it that you can do. You can use it to guide your plot. You can use it to develop your characters. You can also use it to design your cultures and the way your characters move around your world. And so one of my favorite examples to use is Avatar: The Last Airbender. For those who may not be familiar with Avatar: The Last Airbender, basically it boils down to there's a world where people can bend natural elements, mainly water, air, earth, and fire. Due to imperialistic ideologies on the part of the rulers of the Fire Nation attacks the other nations of earth, wind, and water. And the story revolves around the Avatar, the newest Avatar, the youngest Avatar, by personality and type, Aang, and his friends that he has to learn bending from. And why I like using the Avatar: The Last Airbender is because how the elements are spread out within the story affects everything from how their home nations are designed to how the bending works to what the limitations are. And it can lead into some really great character development, depending on the characters that you're looking at. For example, Toph Belfung is a good one to look at because she is a earthbending prodigy, but she's blind. But the reason she's a prodigy is because she learned how to earthbend from these badger moles that are believed to be the originators of earthbending. And they use vibration and basically sort of like an echolocation type thing. It's not quite an echo, but they feel the vibrations in the ground and use those to see. And thus she learned to see her environment by mimicking these badger moles, whom are also blind, according to canon. So basically you're seeing these sort of layers of science because you're looking at physics as well as environmental interactions, which are ecology. So basically her character built up from there and she became a really great earthbender. But then she later learned to bend metal, which was thought to be unbendable by earthbenders because it wasn't pure earth. But metal, of course, as we know it, is a type of earthen, metal is different, but it's still basically got some of the same building blocks. And in a pretty well-known scene, Toph figures out how to metal bend because she can sense, the little pieces of leftover earth in the metal walls and she bends them. So not only did it work for her character development, it also worked as a world building point because the metal, for example, were highly used by the Fire Nation because they were the ones that could work metal on a large scale because, well, they firebended. And they often used metal to keep earthbenders from, you know, bending their way out of situations like they would with, say, a wooden boat or something like that. So when she was able to learn how to metal bend, that changed the game completely in terms of the story. So you can use science and the ideas of science and the limitations to design characters from either the top down or bottom up, however you want to do them, but it's very, very doable. When you're talking about, and I know I'm in my head and I'm rambling, so if there's like a super question that somebody wants to ask, I see Mez knew exactly who I was talking about. And yes, with authors, with advanced refining techniques, she would have been screwed. But as you can see, you can build a character from those sorts of limitations and understandings of very simple concepts. I mean, understanding the, you know, vibrations and being able to sense those vibrations like moles do. Like there's several different types of moles, like star-nosed moles and the like, that do just that. It's a very simple science concept, but they extrapolated it into a very memorable character. I think you were saying something, Dr. Lee?
Oh, I was just co-signing. I was like, yeah, yes, it is.
So science can be used to build characters. I mean, and it doesn't have to be in-depth work, but you do have to understand the concepts that you're using in order to build out your world and your characters. And you can also use them to create conflicts. So again, we're using Toph, for example. If you take her off the earth or you put her on sand or glass, or as Swiftness author mentioned, you know, if you got a more refined metal technique, it's going to be really hard for her to bend that metal. So again, you've got a limitation, but you've also got a creative way of fleshing out this character. In terms of world building, science and world building, a lot of people immediately think technology, but science also influences culture as well. So one of my favorite examples to use for that is Altered Carbon. Altered Carbon initially was a novel. I do not recall the author's name off the top of my head, but Altered Carbon became popularized in the public sphere when Netflix made it into a television show. And and in Altered Carbon, science has fundamentally changed the way humans interact with each other and even within their own bodies and identities. As by this time, by this time, there has been an invention called a stack, and it's basically a little hexagonal piece of equipment that basically can store the impression of a human onto a disc, this little hexagonal, disc or apparatus, whatever you want to call it. And as long as this stack is not destroyed, it can be slotted into another body. And by this point, when the story starts, there's biomechanical, there are like self-determined sleeves that you can put yourself in and things like that. And so humanity doesn't have the same relationships with their bodies because they are so far removed from them at this point that they no longer call them bodies. They call them sleeves, like they're clothing they can take on and off, which essentially they can. And so the repercussions of that radiates throughout how our Altered Carbon is set. Those that are rich and have a lot of money, they can afford any type of sleeve they want. They can make as many clone sleeves of themselves as they want. They're more likely to have their biological sleeve. They're more likely to have access to the higher technologies. they can even back up satellite back up their stack data to even put them in another stack if something happens to their original. So there's a complete societal shift in the way that human beings relate to things simply by the invention of a technology. And it's completely shaped the worlds and how they are interacting with one another.
Well, yeah, and I think that just a lot of these things like you're talking about, but I think really often what science and maybe even biology in particular gives us is this idea of other, right? Like, because we're so locked into as humans how we perceive the world, right? But there's so much variety in how everything else in the world perceives the world, right? You were talking about rats earlier, like how they pick up sound and vibration and all these things is very, very different from us. And we are very locked into our eyes are where our eyes are and our ears are where our ears are, and we smell what we smell. But there's so much more going on. And there's a lot of horror in that, right? I was just thinking like all the great, all your great bad guys, right? Are these others, because it's terrifying. They're picking up on stuff that we don't know, we don't see, we can't control, right? Because we don't know what it is, right? There's that great horror that comes from that. But then there's also that, like I was thinking like the Ursula K. Le Guin stuff, there's all this wonderful, these thought experiments that come with all these other ways of being, right? Exactly. Experiencing these other ways of being that I think have a lot of biological inspiration, right? You think Alien's got that biological inspiration of the parasite coming out, right? The bursting, the horrible, that other, like that's the
it's parasitism,
right? You're like, oh my God, that's terrifying.
But it's parasitism, it's science. It's science.
Bot flies, terrifying. I don't want them. But they're a thing that exists, right? But then also, I was just listening, I was driving, I was listening to a book on tape all about lichens, right? And you're like, lichens, like you step on them, how, whatever. But they're two things living together, and they scientifically stump the crap out of us because we don't know how to classify them necessarily. They're a photobiont and what do they call it? Anyway, it's a fungus and a plant. It's something that can photosynthesize and something that is a fungus essentially living together. They don't always have to be together, so they can reproduce separately. They can reproduce together. It's all variation, and how we actually classify these things is different. We don't, it defies all this, how they behave and where they are and all these things that they do, and I was just, to me, I was like, God, that's so, they're the things that are underneath us when we walk everywhere. They're everywhere around us, but we don't necessarily stop to think about how they're experiencing the world and time and the earth in a completely different way than we are. Everything we do is just so different. And it's a really, that provides all that inspiration for anything, how people do or what your bad guy is, or
they're like I said,
right?
Science is definitely outside. Science in and of itself is a way of thinking, and I think people sometimes don't recognize that that's a way of thinking as well as a way of interacting with your environment. So like I was saying with Toph and her character development, again, it's a way of thinking. So like continuing on talking about plot. So science and plot. Plot is, it's a little subtler with plot than it is, say, with world building or character design. Because, for example, in a plot, you can utilize science as an obstacle. You can use science as a possible tool. You can use it as a plot point. You can use it to build tension, all sorts of things. So like in terms of looking at science as a form of obstacles, you've got flora and fauna like the poppies from The Wizard of Oz, which is an obstacle because these sleeping poppies put them to sleep. Why would plants develop such a mechanism? Self-preservation. And again, you're talking about ecology. You're talking about plants that develop different defense mechanisms in order to protect themselves from herbivores and things that would eat them. So in The Wizard of Oz, it produces a sleeping agent that when breathed in will, make the person fall asleep. And depending on which stories or retellings you will hear. Some will even say that they're, like carnivorous and that they will eat you. But there, like I said, there's been so many retellings of Wizard of Oz at this point that it's kind of silly. But again, they're taken from real life examples of flowers that are carnivorous, flowers that produce things like capsaicin, of course, and then crazy humans come along and they're like, hey, yo, this burns, I want to eat it. But for some things it works, for some things it doesn't. You've got the Yeerks from Animorphs, for example, which are parasitic beings that invade the minds of larger hosts through their ear canal and wrap themselves around their brain and control their movements and their movements, speech, and everything. And they are they're basically a conquering empire. The Animorphs are a YA series, which I really recommend. That was like the first sci-fi series I ever fell for as a kid. Really loved it, but I will admit it gets heavy because it talks about war and some other themes and things like that, but it's great. Even down to the simple things such as learning about poisonous plants and animals and things to create things like poisons to use for weapons, a killing agent in a mystery. Just finding those types of little things out can help you write your story, write perspectives, driving tension, using science to drive tension. So like when I focused on the idea that science as a systematic categorization of information and on the environment and interactions and things like that, the reason I focused on that was because The Arrival relies on linguistics, sociology, and psychology to build tension throughout the story. The Arrival. So for those who aren't familiar with The Arrival, The Arrival is the story of this linguist whom is brought in when these strange alien pods land on Earth. And they are looking to communicate with humanity. And so instead of, immediately going from, blast them because they had shields, they sent in linguists to see if they could devise some way to talk between them and us. So as the movie continues, the urgency gets ramped up because as the linguists are trying to break apart and understand the language, there becomes a tension between, are they talking about a tool? Are they talking about a weapon? Are they trying to give it to us, or are they trying to harm us with it? And so the movie is constantly this push and pull between the scientists that are trying to understand it, including mathematicians, biologists, linguists, and others that, do these types of studies, between those and the people who are fearful and just want to go straight into violence. So there's using science to build tension. If we're talking about conflict, one of my recent favorite animes to watch recently is Dr. Stone. Dr. Stone, long story short, for some reason, there's some bright light one day on Earth and the entire Earth is petrified. Animals, humans, just all turn to stone. And the main character, Senku, is a science-loving nerd. We can argue about proper portrayal of people who like science as not being, loner misanthropes, but we'll talk about that another time because that's a whole discussion in itself. But when you're talking about Senku just so happens to end up in a cave where there's a proper combination of nitric acid and a couple of other chemicals from some bat guano that in the cave that he was in basically unpetrifies him. He's not sure how or why, but it manages to unpetrify him. And he then has to get up and through science and other types of knowledge, try and bring the Earth back from this petrification. Unbeknownst to him, though, it's been about 300 years. It's been several years, and the humans that are left on the planet basically have primitive level of technology. And so he has to rely on nature and natural science properties and things like that to sort of start rebuilding civilization in order to bring back the people on the Earth. However, a conflict happens when one of the early people that he manages to release with the limited amount of this cure he has, decides that modern humanity sucked and that adults are the worst because there's war and famine and disease and all these other things. And so he wants to destroy all adults and smash the statues of adults. And so there's this conflict between science as a modern advancement tool and the use of science as an oppressive tool. And so the two of them are literally at one point, I think in the leave off of season 2, the two factions were literally at war about this. And so it makes Dr. Stonecool, like I said, it's very hands-on and it's very technical in terms of how they utilize science. At one point, they even, go through the steps of how antibiotics are made. So, it's a really fun show. I recommend it if you can find it. I know Crunchyroll has it. There is an English version. So there's science and conflict. And again, motivations. Oh, is somebody trying to cut in? I'm sorry.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, and even so, I'm a big fan of, I like animes and stories that have a magic component in it. And we sometimes think of magic as in conflict with science, but I think there's some really interesting things that can happen in worlds with magic, because magic becomes one of those. So like in our world, how we physically live, physics is really important to how we live. Like we have gravity. Right. Well, in magic worlds, physics is usually the things that gets tweaked. But even in those worlds, it really makes us think about our own lives. In other words, you have to think about the magic in that world still scientifically. In other words, what piece are you going to move? It's like Jenga. What are you going to move and put somewhere else?
Exactly.
So it doesn't go away. You just have to modify it. And then what comes with that? And so like what we see over and over and over again, regardless of whose magic world it is, a lot of magic worlds, they don't have a lot of basic tools that we may take for granted because they don't need them. Because in a lot of magic worlds, they don't have to overcome physics or gravity the same way we have to overcome gravity. So you don't see them using wedges or pulleys. You don't see them kind of coming together to do those things. That's technology is the application of science. They now have magic that can do that. And so they override a whole lot of technologies. In other words, those kind of layers that we build into when we get from one level to the next level. And you also see a recurring theme in a lot of magic worlds where they seem to be stuck in a moment in time.
Yes. Popular example being Harry Potter.
Yeah.
Because I was going to get to that.
Yeah. You have this Victorian idea, but you see it in a lot of magic worlds. They seem to be stuck in this, whatever the golden age of that magic period is, they seem to be stuck there. And some of the thinking is that because they don't have this cumulative effect, they're not building, or you don't see a lot of building. But the thing that moves a lot of these magic stories is some sort of new magical science comes. There's a paradigm shift in how that magic is used. But in science, we see these paradigm shifts. In real life and how we use science, we see these paradigm shifts happening a little bit more frequently because everything is cumulative. Science is cumulative. That's one of the things that we know, like our citation practices. That's a history of us building off of each other's information, each other's knowledge, and going from there and making something new and creative.
Right, exactly. So that kind of leads me into
I'm realizing, can I jump in, Kenyatta?
Sure.
I'm realizing, we talk a lot about, science fiction and magic, magical worlds and so on. So I have to say science fiction is one of my favorite genres. But at the same time, I also find in science fiction some of the novels or movies that are kind of annoying me the most because, as Kenyatta mentioned earlier, sometimes they go from A to N, or you just don't see the thread. There's something that falls. And when that happens, then it's kind of, I lose interest personally.
Right.
So there needs to be really, whatever it is, if it's the presumptions, the scientific world needs to be really set and staged in a realistic way. Obviously, you're going to go into a magical world, a world that doesn't exist and so on. But there needs to be some good foundations there that are real for me to be able to kind of follow in the story, even though, you know, I'm going to be eventually in a world of magic where the science doesn't strictly apply necessarily.
Right. But I think I forget who says it, but there is a quote that says something along the lines of, at a certain point, technology is indistinguishable from magic. So that tends to be the mindset that I come to when I'm utilizing science in my stories, is making things make sense to the point where the magic is seamless and you can't really find fault in it. So as Jennifer was pointing out, oh, was somebody going to say something? But as Jennifer pointed out, as Dr. Lee pointed out, like in Harry Potter, you know, you get stuck in those technological periods and you don't move forward, which again can create conflict, because again, you've got the Muggle world that has technology versus the magical world that has magic. You know, humans may not be able to, Muggles may not initially be able to fight back against magic, but given time, they definitely can, because they're forced to be creative in their problem solving, versus wizards who let magic do the work for them. Again, that also creates and sets up themes and character behaviors in your story. So again, there's that same sort of thread. When it comes to science as motivations for characters, you've got things like Big Hero 6. When you revolve around Baymax and how Baymax is supposed to be utilized. Takashi basically making him to be a healer, companion, friend, versus Hero in the height of his grief and anger, using him as a machine of death and war.
It's so funny. No, I'm sorry. I'm old that when you say Betamax, I was just like, God, what an old technology to put into a book, right? and then my mind went back, and I was like, oh, right, because anyway, sorry.
No, it's fine.
I was like, oh, it's a character's name. Like,
yeah.
So Betamax technology. Sorry.
No, Baymax. It's a little robot. If you type, it's BAYAX, MAX. You'll come up and you'll go, oh. Okay. But basically. So that's in talking motivations for your characters, because you got two brothers who have different ideas about how to utilize Baymax, and how Baymax is actually utilized in the story is also something that could be talked about. But I'm trying to leave time for questions because I know some people got to go, so I'm trying to get through this. And then in terms of foreshadowing, Looper. Long story short, in this sort of dystopian future that has been taken over by a telekinetic, because of the way people interchangeably use the two, this person that has telekinetic abilities has basically taken over the world. And there's this profession called a looper, in which these people are kind of like mafia types that are hired to kill people in the past in order to make sure that their deaths aren't discovered in the future. And our main character is played by Bruce Willis. Well, the antagonist and the protagonist are technically the same character. And the Bruce Willis's character goes back in time because he's going to have his loop closed. So when they pay them in things like blocks of silver and gold. And when you get a body, because usually they're covered, and it have the gold is basically taped to their back, that's basically their payout, and their loop is closed. So these people get paid a lot of money knowing that eventually they're going to die, but they get a lot of money to basically blow for the rest of their lives. Well, Bruce Willis's character goes back in time to save his wife, because when they close your loop, they erase everything. They kill your family, your loved ones, all of that. You don't exist. Trigger warnings for that. I apologize. So basically, he's gone back in time to try and stop the rise of this overlord. And in the midst of him doing this, his younger self, basically he escapes his younger self. And so his younger self is going through the movie trying to find where he's going and find this kid. And through the course of the whole movie, you learn that humanity, some of human population are telekinetic. And they can basically about lift a quarter, most of them. which is again applying a scientific limit, because yeah, you can lift it with your mind, but really, like, are you really going to lift 20 pounds, 30 pounds, 40 pounds with your mind? How does that work? How does that affect you? So they put a very arbitrary weight limit on how much most people could do. It just basically became sort of a party trick. And when you meet the I might get the child's name wrong, but when you meet Arthur's mother, you don't know her. She's his mother at the time. But when you meet her, you see a scene of her playing with her lighter, which is like a pretty big square metal, Bic lighter. Like a flip lighter, and she's playing with it using telekinesis. And he even points out that most people can't, lift more than a quarter. How are you doing that? And she's like, I've just always been good with it. And she even goes on to tell a story about how a man was trying to impress her at a bar and that she used her power to hold it down. You haven't hold the quarter down to the table. So you hadn't heard about people using the telekinetic ability in the opposite direction, nor something that could be 2 times heavier than the average quarter that people can lift. So you see that she's a pretty powerful telekinetic in her own right. So when you get to the sun and due to, I forget exactly what the circumstance was, but he throws a tantrum and she literally has to hide in like this metal closet that she has in the house because he's making all these things fly all over the place. Things are breaking. So then of course, she find out that this woman is actually his mother. She was introduced as his aunt because his mother had died during one of his tantrums, but it was actually her sister. So when you get to the child, you see through the foreshadowing of talking about the aunt and the aunt's, exploits as a telekinetic, when you get to Arthur and he's gone all the way to 100, you add in the I don't really know much about his dad trope, you don't have to suspend disbelief to understand how you got from Sarah to Arthur in terms of power scaling. So that's one way you can use science as a form of limiter, but also as a form of foreshadowing. And then, of course, themes, because all stories have themes and messages. So what are you looking at in terms of themes and messages? What is science? Where are the lines drawn? Are we allowed to play God? Are we not allowed to play God? Categorization of people, is that a necessary thing? Is it not a necessary thing? Aliens versus humans, there's so many cultural things that you can play with, themes in terms of science and humans, technology and humans, the rejection thereof or the acceptance thereof. We could talk all day about that. But I want to, as starting kind of as a primer to kind of start us off, that's kind of what I wanted to go over. Now, if anybody has questions for, panelists, if there's a specific thing you'd like to know, please, by all means, ask them. We can sort of kind of treat this as a break if you all need a break, but I know some of my panelists kind of have to move on to other things, if their schedules have, changed. So I wanted there to be a chance for you guys to ask them any specific questions about their field. Or something like that, just in case you wanted to get it in before they left. But while we wait on questions, if there are any, so I guess I'd ask the question. So do you? Oh, okay, cool. So I guess my question would be, do you see science in terms of, this very, because I know even within the science community, we're arguing all the time between hard sciences, soft sciences, and that sort of thing. So do you see, so in terms of talking about a bridge subject like this, where you're talking about a creative endeavor versus a scientific one, do you think science, the way I've applied it, do you think that is a interesting way of looking at science, or do you think that it should focus more on proper world building or what have you? What are your thoughts on how science can be utilized in storytelling?
Yeah, I think all the stories you've been telling us, all the books are actually, very, very interesting, using science in many different ways and contexts. But as a scientist, what I would say is, especially in sci-fi stories, science fiction stories, what is, I think, for me would be interesting in developing characters or context is to really kind of step away from the way we see the world as humans, and we anthropomorphize a lot. And so, earlier, Dr. Kovacs was saying that, Alien, for example, is very kind of fascinating because it's a creature that it doesn't behave like humans. Also, often, for example, when we think of extraterrestrial life, we think that they almost look like humans, right? They'll have a head, a torso, and legs, and 2 hands. They're just designed like humans, but their head might be bigger and their torso might be smaller. That's about it, right? The aliens we imagine are just too human-like. If life was created on another planet, it might look very completely different from the life form. It's not going to be created based on our own image. It might look like a blob. It might look like something completely different, and not necessarily like even in Alien, it's still kind of it feels almost like a dinosaur, right? Some kind of insect. Is still a form of life that we're very familiar with to some extent, right? But so as a plant biologist, for example, when we think of plants, it's something we don't easily relate to because plants are a very different life form than ours, right? They don't have legs, they don't move, they don't uproot themselves, and so it's very, very kind of interesting to, what I always do and what I invite my students to do, to really think of themselves as a plant, to be in the shoes of a plant, right? How would a plant, if a plant can't move, how would it ward off all the herbivores that might come and chew it, all the bacteria and diseases? And so as much as we think of it as a simple life form, it's actually quite complex. And I always start by saying that one of the simplest plants we're studying a lot, called Arabidopsis, actually has as many genes as humans, and it's chosen. Was sequenced actually right before the human genome was sequenced, and it was chosen for sequencing because it had one of the smallest genomes. So a lot of other plants will have much larger genomes, and so how do they cope, right? And obviously they're going to cope in ways that are very, very different. Plants have been actually very, very successful organisms in terms of populating the planet Earth. Where does that success come from? And despite the fact that they don't move, right? So they've been co-opting a lot of other organisms, be it birds, bees for pollination, lots of insects for pollination, birds, a lot of animals. Their seeds can be easily dispersed. They even their sexual, their reproduction is also very different. Oftentimes plants will have both a male and a female structure within their flowers, such that they can also reproduce with themselves. They don't have to go find another mate, especially imagine if a plant is a pioneer plant in a new environment, it could, mate with itself and so on. So plants are quite fascinating. And so whenever we think of a kind of a new world, fantasy world, sci-fi world, we have to think about, what works for them. How do they co-opt us? So, when we decided to become, to move on as human beings from hunter-gatherers to farming communities, we adopted plants, we domesticated plants. But to what extent, it's interesting to also ask, to what extent did plants co-opt us and, and kind of tricked us to adopt them? Just flowers, for example, right? Flowers, we only kind of use them for their beauty, right?
Right.
So it's
Depending
kind of,
on,
we have to think of interactions and so on,
Yeah, definitely. So there are 2 questions in the chat. Arthur Goddess asks, have you ever done or heard of research being done based on a science aspect of fiction? What do you think as a scientist of following a fictional concept through research? Personally, fun thing. When I was in undergrad, I actually read a paper that was written on how actually the zombie apocalypse would actually flow in terms of epidemiology and numbers, and it talks about how what things would look like if a cure was invented versus if there was a vaccine that was invented, and it doesn't necessarily take into account like all the factors of injuries, that sort of thing, but it does incorporate the idea of reinfection rates, and like if there's a vaccine, there's still potentially more victims to be taken in by this virus, but they're likely to resist it and they're less likely to turn and spread it, so the numbers are kind of slowly taper off, versus say finding a cure pretty much just puts the population back at a reset, meaning you reset the number of people that can be reinfected and so on and so forth. So I thought that was, so people do it. People do it. Another pretty famous study involved World of Warcraft and the blood plague disease, which had been actually a computer programming error that had basically kept a debuff from a particular boss attached to the pets of people. So like in World of Warcraft, they had like little pets and assistants, and it got connected to the dog, to the pets, and it spread through the game, and it was leading to mass player death because it was like a slow bleed debuff kind of thing. So it was slowly killing players, and it spread through World of Warcraft like a plague, and epidemiologists still study it today. I haven't recently looked at articles on it, but yeah, epidemiologists study it and use that as an example of studying epidemics and things like that. So we already do it. We already think about it. So it's not a new concept, at least for me myself. But I personally, guilty pleasure admissions here, but at some point I want to like be able to write like fictional papers about like Pokemon, and because you have professors and they all study different aspects of Pokemon behavior, and I'm like, I want to be able to write like papers on Pokemon regional variants and stuff.
Somebody did a phylogeny of Pokemon.
Yes, and there's somebody on Twitter.
A phylogenetic tree thing on Pokemon.
There's one on Twitter too.
Published in like an education journal, but yeah, they did a whole thing, especially the recent ones. Yeah.
Yeah, there's somebody that's been drawing up trees on Twitter as well. So that's been fun to look at. But like
I think it's also important to know that in physics that happens a lot. Like a lot of physics and computer science technology was driven by curiosity and plot points introduced in sci-fi shows like Star Trek.
Yep, that's how we got cell phones and all kinds of stuff.
Yeah, so we got cell phones, like the tricorder. It's like it was inspired by that. It happens all the time. Yeah.
I'd say like the field of astrobiology is like heavily influenced by the idea that, because it's like, well, we just have to imagine what's out there, right? I mean, and that really kind of all came about when we started space exploration, that entire idea of panspermia in reverse, right? Like, so, if not even in reverse, but both ways, right? The idea that because people were scientists were like legitimately wrote a letter and said, hey, if you bring back something from space, it could go bad. And that's kind of where the whole field of like astrobiology came from, and people really started to think about it. But that was all inspired by what we were writing. I mean, the science fiction that we were writing about, from things being out there, right? And where that came from. So I'd say, it's not my area, but I think a lot of what they think about.
No, I think it's fascinating. That reminds me, if you're interested in things like astrobiology and what like biology and animals and ecologies would look like, there is Alien Worlds on Netflix. It's a great what if like mockumentary of what life on certain other planets would look like based on their environments, their tills, and all sorts of things. They talk about concepts of like sexual evolution, movement, food acquisition, predator-prey relationships, parasitic relationships, but it's called Alien Worlds, and it's really, really fascinating. It's complete conjecture, but just seeing the creativity of the different aliens, because none of them look human. There's like a monkey rabbit type hybrid thing. There's like these creatures that are like spiders almost, like fleshy spiders almost, that reproduce by sporing. There's a whole like race of intelligent beings that are nothing but these flesh cubes, but they're a hive mind. So and they're
I was going to actually say, yeah, centralized, like, so the idea of a centralized intelligence, we're very biased in thinking about centralized intelligence, about this idea of brain. And when Ment was talking about plants, like, right, so you know, how does a plant decide where to go when it's growing? You know, it's at the shoots. We know that, you know, we know where it happens, but we don't necessarily know how it's happening. And it's the same with like fungus, right? But we know that it experiences everything. Like swarm intelligence is a really, how these systems organize without a central, you know, without a brain, for us is really hard to imagine, but
Yes.
it's probably much more common than we think it is. Even for things that we know have brains, it seems that not all of the important information is stored in the brain, right? So it's that
Yes.
those famous experiments with nematodes, right? So nematodes are flatworms, they live in the soil. We study them a lot. We know a lot about them, basically because they can they're easy to maintain and we can regenerate, right? So you can like cut off their heads and they'll regenerate parts. You can split them in half and you can grow two heads, right? It's fun for everybody. But there's things where they've you know, trained them to react to a certain stimuli, right? Cut the head off from the bottom and to see if the bottom part that regenerates the head still reacts to the same stimuli. So does it still learn? Does it still remember the thing that it learned? And it turns out that it does, right? Which means that somehow this is stored somewhere other than, you know, in the head. Now these are nematodes, right? So, but we see some of that idea of not everything being stored in the central part. You know, we are very brain dominant, right? Like this is
right. But that's our paradigm. That's how we understand our environment, though.
Right. But it seems, you know, when you look at like cuttlefish, you look at squid, you look at
there's
other things
squids,
going
octopus,
on, right?
yeah.
So even in those where they had that centralized, there's still thought and decisions being made outside of the central brain region for those animals, right? And let alone you look at fungus, you look at giant mycelium and honey mushrooms, you know, they experience something on one end of and they're huge, they're giant. It's one of like the largest organisms that we know exists is a honey mushroom, right? It experiences something on one end and it knows it on the other end, right? You know, you talk about them being kind of these fungal computers, and they're not as fast as a silicone base, but you know, that's something that they've been working on for a really long time is thinking about these biological based computers based on this idea of these non-centralized intelligences, right?
Tree networks, tree networks, fungi networks, and all of those.
Right,
things.
and how those interact, right? So when Matt was talking about, you know, plants aren't just manipulating, you know, the bugs and the people; they're also manipulating everything that's going on beyond underground, right? These giant hyphal networks that take up all these things, and these sums are way more than their parts, but they're completely different, right?
And there's like 30 writing ideas, like just in this conversation alone. So again, it doesn't have to be technical, but just using science to change the way you think about a subject, can really, you know, give you new ideas. But yeah, it's let's see, did I see another question? I have to scroll up here. Sorry, Dr. Kovacs, I wasn't trying to cut you off. But let's see. Oh, how do you feel about mainstream media using science concepts? Does it spark interest or undermine the objective truth? Dr. Eiley, what do you think? Actually, Dr. Lee, what do you think about that?
Repeat that question again, please.
Sure. How do you feel about mainstream media using science concepts? Does it spark interest or undermine the objective truth?
I mean, you're telling stories. You don't have to have objective truth when you're telling stories. I mean, that's the whole thing of telling stories and being creative. You can take a little tidbit and let it seed you and take you wherever you want to go. So what's your purpose of your storytelling? Is your storytelling to tell quote unquote objective truth? I mean, I can go into a whole narrative about, what objectivity is. Is it possible? I think we can approach it. We work toward it. But like, if you're telling stories, just tell a good story. And in the process, we could talk about morality. We could talk about ethics. We could talk about right or wrong. We could talk about actual factuals versus interpretations and perceptions. Like, you have all these options. I think it's important to know that science is as creative as what we call the arts.
I agree.
Like, it takes all this innovation. It takes all this entrepreneurship. It takes all this history, all that same stuff that we sometimes think of, oh, that's for this particular field. That's not true. And maybe I'm biased because as an ecologist, I'm very, very, I see things very, very integrated. I see the web of it. When I teach ecology to students, I teach them the answer in ecology is usually, in ecology, what's the answer? The answer is it depends. That's the official answer in ecology. If you ask an ecologist a question, I answer every time is, well, it depends. It depends on which stop.
Complex.
Yeah.
It's complex and it depends. Yeah,
it is complex. And it's complex because there's so many layers. There's so many moving parts. And it's just like when we do math, you can start with 3 bases, but depending on how you combine them, in the order that you combine them, at the time that you combine them, and the place that you combine them. And so the big tenet in ecology is, yes, it depends. And you're like, well, it depends on what? It depends on place, space, and time. It depends on who else is there, when they're there, all those things. And you can take just a tidbit of it and make such an amazing story. You can take an actual factual and let that anchor you. You can either focus on that actual factual science and then make that the theme, or you can take it and go, I want to tweak it just a little bit. I want to take this real fact, but I want to take it out of this traditional context. Now what would happen? Boom. Using science as writing challenges, like a writing prompt, how you have these little prompts, now here it is, now go. Which way do you go with it?
Yeah, it's kind of like when Octavia Butler, she was going on a trip. I want to say it was to Brazil or somewhere below the equator, and she was nervous about parasites in the water. And to rid herself of that fear, she wrote, I believe it's called bloodworms, but she created these alien races of worms that have basically had a symbiotic relationship with human males to incubate their children. And she wrote a story to rid herself of the fear. So, you can use science in those sorts of ways, as prompts, as challenges, or as ways to even alleviate your own fears or anxieties. I'll have to look up the exact title, but while I'm looking at that, Dazzly Cat asked the question. This is more for our ecologist on the panel, but how would you go about creating an ecology for something like taking deep sea creatures or deep sea like creatures, for example, into sky creatures that swim in the clouds? Can you create a believable ecology around that? What would be the things you would consider, I suppose, is what they're asking.
Yeah, so I would say this. I think about that often. I actually think you not only need an ecologist, you also need some folks in the physical science realm too, because the first thing you have to do is overcome gravity. And we take gravity for granted in ecology. That's one of my just constants. I just assume it's going to be there, and it is what it is. Well, now you're going to take them to the sky. What are we doing now to overcome that gravity? What's happening in the atmosphere? Now we need some atmospheric scientists. So I think this is beyond just ecology. Thinking about that, I think we can make it believable. But I think the hard thing for us for suspending is we're still so earth-centric. We still assume that these rules, and it's not just our earth rules, but whatever our cultural biases are. Like
Yep,
in so
yep,
many
yep.
world building, we still assume that essentially there's always going to be exploitative capitalism, or we always assume there's going to be, hierarchical prejudice. Why do we assume this in these worlds? We've had actual human cultures that didn't have either of those things, let alone in our imagination. But we can get so locked in, and it takes practice. Like it takes deep practice to imagine what's your normal as, first of all, not just not existing, but I think the first step is acknowledging that it doesn't have to be the only way. Like, I think that's the first thing. Acknowledge that you can have something a little bit different. Then it opens you up to something else. But then tapping into multiple knowledges, like ecology, atmospheric science, physiology, all of that, all of those things, because there's a physiology. Your physiology changes based on where you are. I just said place, space, and time matter. It depends. Well, how you metabolize things matters, how close you are to sea level or not. Like that would be, so that's why I would go like, how are they metabolizing? You may not even focus on like how they're actually able to fly. You can stay just in the physiology and just fiat literally everything else in the world and focus on one tiny thing, which is what's happening at the molecular and cellular level in these large creatures that are able, even if you just magic them in the sky, you still can deal with that other stuff.
And there's no flying things up there. Like there's spiders and stuff up there. Like there are things that get up there and move around, right? So it's just something we don't look at necessarily, but people have gone up there and sampled, and there's like little spiders that get really high up there, and that's how they disperse, right? So
that's not nightmarish to think about.
Oh, but they're wonderful. They're delightful. As an arthropod, it's like, that's so cool, right? Because they balloon, they net, they get up there, and there are things that aren't as constrained by gravity as we tend to be, right? So there's birds and stuff, but there's seed dispersal. I mean, that's how seeds get around, right? If you think about what's actually up there, so there is an ecology up there. It's just not really well studied. It's not something people look at.
Yeah, it seems the sky has the same problem as the sea. We just can't get up there long enough to look.
You've heard stories of, all of a sudden it rained frogs or fish or something. So yeah, a lot of things can be sucked out of the water and get up there. They won't stay suspended and living all their life there. Now, I study bacteria lately that produce antibiotics. And one of the bacteria that I'm interested in was actually discovered in Japan in 1957. And you know what? It's kind of everywhere. And, initially I thought, what are the odds that I'm going to find that same? But it's everywhere. And in fact, all these bacteria, they sporulate and so on, and they have a world distribution, the biogeography, they get spread through winds and so on. You hear sometimes about sand from the Sahara being blown all the way to the United States and bringing, so they go to the Arctic, places where, nobody has ever gone, or they go everywhere. Right. So, with spores and bacteria and so on, and spores are actually meant to be dispersed. They're very sturdy. They're going to resist a lot of things, water, UV, and so on. And hey, if they're microscopic, you get rid of the physical problems, the challenge of, being in a gravity-free world. But there might be some context also to create that gravity.
And we are back to the time. When I teach ecology to students, especially when we go through nutrient cycling, like the carbon cycle or the nitrogen cycle, I remind students, because we don't think about this, the gas you burn, that's a carbon molecule that existed hundreds of millions of years ago. That carbon molecule hadn't seen the light of the atmosphere, hadn't been swept up in the atmosphere for millions of years. And imagine now if these carbon molecules had like special little signatures on them that can like undo us, because they were trapped. They were literally trapped. Like, we don't think about that. Like when we move like these nutrients, we're assuming, they're just always here. No, they're locked away, frozen away for time, millions upon millions upon millions of years. And now all of a sudden we put them all out at once. This many carbons weren't meant to be here at the same time, like this.
Right, exactly. Like, so like there's so many ways you can do that. And Dazzly Cat was talking about cloud manta ray feeding on spider swarms. And I was like, yes, that could definitely be a way to do it. And if you want to take it a step further, okay, if we're talking about cloud manta rays, are those cloud manta rays actually, some form of mobile protists that school together like fish to create that manta shape that we're familiar with? And that it's a swarm feeding on another swarm, and there's communications between all these different parts and what's doing what and where. There's so many ways to think about how to build animals and ecologies, but a lot of times people that don't understand how things, how science and different relationships actually work scientifically, they're limited in their thoughts and ideas. But when you understand science and dig deeper into what science knows and uses and does, you've got so many ideas just from that conversation of, okay, if I wanted to put something that looks like it swims in the sky, how would I do that? There's 20 different, ideas being talked about in the chat, when people are going off on tangents. So science is a very useful tool for telling stories. But again, it's about how you apply it. Are you applying it in terms of your world building, like cloud manta rays? Are you applying it in terms of your characters? Yeah, exactly. That's a cat, like a cloud manta ray swarm with a hive mind. And so like you're changing how the dynamics works between characters, civilizations. Like for example, me and Dean Lee here. I call her Dean Lee because that's her Twitter name. But we were talking, before this panel, and we were talking, and she was talking about how, when we're looking at building a world, there's geography that has to be taken into account. There's location that has to be taken into account. What are the relationships looking like when you've got a society that's built by a river versus one that is landlocked? What lands and animals and things, like what are they eating? Because again, the ecology of where you're living is going to define what your diet is. It's just like Japan, you're going to have a lot of seafood, a lot of seafood-based dishes and things like that. Because again, they're island, they're surrounded by water most of the time, except for the landlocked areas. So there's a lot of seafood recipes and things like that. Versus say in the West, especially in the United States, you're going to have a lot more beef and red meat, chicken, those sorts of things in terms of our diet, and probably less seafood, because unless you're living on those coastal areas, seafood can be expensive because transportation. How does transportation work? What medicines do they use? Herbalism is still a thing. It's still studied, it's still utilized. Foraging has become a very big thing thanks to people like I always forget her name, but Anise Nicole on TikTok, who is bringing foraging back to the forefront. And what's edible plants, what aren't edible plants.
The Black Forager? You're talking about the Black Forager? Yeah, she's amazing. Yeah, she's absolutely awesome.
And she's so fun. And then there's another TikToker I follow who I have to look up her name, but she's like, hi, your friendly neighborhood poison ivy here. And she's going to talk about a plant that is, poisonous, and how it works and why. So, and her mantra is, I just give you the information, be careful what you do with it, kind of thing. So as technology has changed and allowed more information to become accessible, you really can use science to shape how you think about your writing, how you develop your writing and your plots and your worlds and your characters, which kind of segues into some resources and things that I kind of wanted to talk about. So when you're using science in your work, how do you go about doing that? Yes, this panel, you happen to have this panel where you have access to some scientists that do study those things, who want to interact at that intersection of writing and science and that sort of thing. So they do exist. Also, there are those that work in the science field as science consultants, who work as consultants on movies, TV shows, and things of that nature to provide scientific basis for things that they do on television shows. And of course, when people think about science and science consulting and media and things like that, most people immediately go to nitpickers. And it's not even about nitpicking. Like, yeah, sure, it's nice that the director of Titanic changed the Starry Sky because Neil deGrasse Tyson complained about it. But, scientists that come in and go, well, you have an alien idea here. I think this would be a creative way to present it. That's completely different, because I've even consulted on a book or two about science and how certain powers would manifest within the limits of our physics and what we know and understand. I'm going to have to remember the title, because I believe it's the Parkland Girls. It's a book about sisters who were genetically modified through their father genetically modifying his own genetic code through surgery. And they developed different powers. And one of the powers was that one of the girls had like super strength, super defense. And, I was asked how can I, portray this defensive power in a way that's realistic? And I said, well, they're bugs and chitin. Chitin can be very strong, depending on how it's layered, how big the animal is, that sort of thing. That's something you could use as sort of like a outer shell for her defense that can be chipped off. But again, you would have had to have, known about, insect biology in order to say, hey, chitin might be a way to go about doing this. Or, that sort of thing. So there's consultants that you can use, and sometimes they'll do it for free just because it's fun, but depending on their time and their time constraints, you might have to pay. So, again, that's if your project, requires that level. And earlier, like I was saying, social media. Scientists are all over social media at this point. There are science spaces on Twitter. There are science spaces on Twitch. There are science spaces all over TikTok and Facebook groups. So you can find them. But again, always with a cautionary tale, be mindful, try to do your due diligence, because, everybody can say whatever they like on the internet. So, do your due diligence and that sort of thing. If you're looking at websites, your best bets are to look at things like edu, the end in edu. ORG can sometimes be useful, but you have to be careful because, again, anybody can make an organization. But if it's like a nationally recognized organization, or it's run by, or it could be run by some decent, or at least notable and accepted societies and things like that in terms of like different sciences. Those are usually okay to use. Places like Science, Discovery, Science News, places like that, where the people that are writing them are usually scientists themselves, or at least, student scientists in those areas. Those are great places to find science information or inspiration.
Can I put a plug in? So
Yeah.
Museums a lot of times have like Ask a Curator, and curators are amazing. They're wonderful. Natural history museums, science museums, they are, they are public facing institutions that want to interact with the public. And that doesn't have to be in person. That can be online and virtually. I know like the British Natural History Museum is amazing. Their curators are fantastic. They know all kinds of stuff about all kinds of things. You want to talk about, invertebrates, they're aquatic invertebrate people. Don't think like you're like, wait, what? You want to build an aquatic thing in the sky? They will tell you everything about what's below. They're amazing. They're so much fun. They think about things, I love sitting with curators. The British Natural History Museum curators are insanely amazing. They think about, decolonizing. They're thinking about all of these ways of interacting and how the history of these collections that they do, it's mind-boggling. And there's times they just host open office hours. They're just online waiting for people to come ask them the most far out difficult question that they can fall down a rabbit hole with you. Yeah. So, those types of institutions are really there to interact with the public. And they have a wealth of knowledge, and people who just, oh my God, you want to geek out with somebody. they will geek out with you. That is like their job day and night. That and their
Yep.
masters of organization. They're just they're really there for that. And
Yes,
and honestly,
absolutely.
guys, you're not
Also,
wasting anybody's time. Like
yeah.
they wanna
Also,
do
if you live near universities, also look around your local areas, because a lot of times they will host community events. They will like when I was going to Indiana University, our science department basically had a sort of like beer and science type deal where we would meet in this bar called Bears Bar, and we would meet in their back room, and different labs or scientists would come in and they would talk about their work with the public, and the public could ask questions. Heck, you can even look up. So I was going to go on a bit of a rant about Wikipedia. Yes, I know there's some people that are cringing in the chat and otherwise, but I recommend Wikipedia as a starting point. Big caveat, starting point, because especially nowadays, you because Wikipedia, especially now that people are utilizing it more and it's open, a lot of science-based articles are handled by labs and people that study them. For example, the lab that I worked in worked on electric fish in my master's program. They maintain the Wikipedia page on electric fish. Between the various labs that study them. So if you like go to Wikipedia and you type in something, you can type it in, and if you scroll to the bottom, if they're done right, there's a bunch of resources at the bottom. Use that as a kind of an introduction to whatever concept you're looking for, because a lot of times the article itself is user friendly. Of course, not all of them, because sometimes they assume you have a lot of knowledge you don't. I tend to find that to be a problem in like the physics side of things. They'll just start explaining things as if you understand the basis of it, and they're just talking about this specific thing within it. So sometimes that can be a problem, but if you're looking for things and a place to start, you can definitely go to Wikipedia and then fish from the resources, because usually the resources are, at least like I've seen on the science side, they're usually other papers, somebody's lab website. Also, universities are also good. But again, you have to be mindful of where you're looking, because some are for profit and do have certain leanings and things of that nature. So you have to be mindful of those things. But a lot of times the science labs have lab websites. So you'll not only have the contacts of who's working in those labs at the time, but you'll have samples of their papers. They usually have an overview of the things that their lab studies. And emailing them 9 times out of 10, if you want to get your hands on a paper, usually you can email them outright and they'll be like, oh, you need this paper? Sure, here you go. They don't really have a problem giving a paper if you want to know something. Like I got somebody's dissertation on Inanna and Erastigall because I was looking to do some story work about them. Well, it was more for a spiritual work for me personally, but I just happened to find them and their dissertation listed when I was looking. And I just basically sent them an email like, hey, I would love to look at your dissertation on this because I'm doing the spiritual journey and I'm doing this thing. And, you probably have the most in-depth thing on what I'm looking for. Do you mind if I have a copy of your dissertation? She's like, yeah, as long as you're not going to write anything or do anything public with it, I don't care. And she gave me the paper. So, and plus, again, as you've probably seen in this panel, we're all geeks. We love science. We love talking science. So if you want to know something, we will happily, science up on you all day. Somebody in a fandom server that I'm in made the mistake of asking a genetics question about quirks for My Hero Academia. So and I'm going, I can totally give you a whole rundown on genetics and how that works and what that would look like and what possibly types of, evolutionary convergence that happens with these types of quirks, that types of quirks. And they were like, you'd really do that? Absolutely. You want me to? And I spent I spent like an hour just info dumping about genetics and how that likely worked evolutionarily. So like, honestly, if you get us talking about the things we like, we will talk to you all day about them. So approach them. Don't be afraid to approach them. Like I said, Twitter has a pretty thriving science community. Usually you can use hashtags. If you put in hashtag ecology, hashtag biology, evolution, whatever, you'll see a bunch of like tweets and stuff that come up all the time, and you can pick people out from there. Conventions. I actually met Dean Lee through a convention. I met her at DragonCon. Which year particularly, I don't remember, but she was hosting a panel similar to this, and they were talking about science and media. And, they're going back and forth, and people asking them questions. And somebody asked a question that was more evolution oriented. And I kind of raised my hand. And I'm like, well, technically the answer to that is this. And she's like, why aren't you up here? I'm like, I didn't know people did this. So like there's different ways to meet people, and like I said, just ask. Sometimes just asking really help, will really get you what you're looking for. Also, there's a lot of resources online that you can utilize. One of my favorite resources to point people to when they're asking about exoplanets and building planets and things like that, I send them to EYES on NASA. It's eyes.nasa.gov, and you can basically go in there, and they have all these different interactive maps and files on things like exoplanets, asteroids, the solar system, solar weather, space weather, all kinds of things. There's a whole bunch of them, and you can click on them. You can learn about the planets and the solar systems and the star systems they're in. And from there, you can kind of extrapolate to things that you're looking for. So that's a lot of fun for me to play with. Science News for Students is also great because it's run by I believe it's the AAAS. They produce science, the Science Journal, and they're basically for students. Their articles are written to be accessible, so you can look for different topics and subjects there if you're looking for more information. Also, there is the Planet Construction Kit is a book by Mark Rosenfelder. I learned about this guy because I'm also a linguistics nerd, and I bought his language construction kit book when I was getting into conlanging at the beginning. And he has a book called The Planet Construction Kit, which you can find on Amazon, and I think Barnes & Noble as well. And it basically has some introductory chapters on different science concepts and things that you might need to think about when you're world building. So that I often recommend. And if you're also looking to like do primitive technology and things like that, this book is also really, really useful. Because like I said at the beginning, I am a huge like book nerd. And so I love books, and especially love collecting books on nonfiction topics for things that I would like to study or utilize. This book is great because it goes over like all these ancient inventions and things that people were using during those time periods. Like, for example, you're like, well, they can't be using batteries back in the, Egyptian times, but Egyptians had a form of battery. It was a sort of hydrosalt battery. It didn't last long, but it worked. They had automatic doors through simple hydraulic physics. They had automatic doors. The doors of the temple would open every day on their own at sunrise, and close every day when it was done. So like there's a ton of neat things in here that I loved using and pulling from when I was designing certain things or ideas during world building. I recommend that as well. And Explain Stuff also has a really neat timeline of technological advancement that you can look at as well. And like I said, I do have a resource page that I'll put in the treasure trove as soon as I finish but I'll add to the resource page some of the other things. But like I said, TikTok is another great one. Again, it's not as YouTube and Crash Course. If anything, if you don't want to chase down books or whatever, Crash Course. Crash Course has a ton of courses in the sciences. They've got astronomy, they've got anatomy and physiology, they've got some basic biology, chemistry, organic chemistry, physics. Like they have full courses, and like the courses at this point are so in depth that a lot of colleges are allowing students to view those videos and interact with those videos for credit. They're like actually listed as considered as courses, for credit. So they're really good. And not only that, they have plenty of other videos on other things, history, economy. I learned a lot about economy from their economy course. The world mythologies courses introduced me to a lot of myths that I didn't know. There's a ton of courses on a ton of different things. There's one of my favorites recently was their course on linguistics. So they have courses, they have experts come in. So the people that are teaching the courses, they're experts that come in to talk about their areas of expertise. So you definitely can get a lot out of those courses, and they're great for kind of podcast listening. If, you want to just turn it on and let them talk while you're doing something else, they're great for that. There's also podcasts as well. A lot of scientists have podcasts now. Well, they'll come on and they'll talk about things. I'm part of the SciComm network at NPR because I met Joe Palca while I was in graduate school, and he was just getting it off the ground with his Joe's Big Idea, but now it's the SciComm network, and there's a lot of scientists who do science writing, public outreach, as well as they have a spot on NPR radio as well that talks to science, pop media and science, that sort of thing. There's that as well in terms of resources. And plus, you can also find books on various subjects. I have, like I said, an entire shelf dedicated to just nonfiction books that I bought because I wanted to better understand a subject or something that I wasn't actually, familiar with. So again, it's not about, having to be, a degree holder, but understanding science or the concepts you want to use, understanding them opens you up to doing a lot more creative things with your writing in terms of, like I said, the character building, the plot building, because science can be used as a limiter and a challenge, because if you've got a hard magic system that has hard and fast rules, just like say chemistry and physics and those sorts of things, you're going to have to get creative in how you work around those problems. Versus hand waving away cuz magic, you have to get creative in working around those problems, and you can show how creative your characters are. You can use them to build your societies, you can use it to build, the thought processes and morality, because again, even seeing now how we utilize and appreciate science has changed the views on how things work, because we've gone from the little person theory in terms of embryology and reproduction to it's a whole host of complicated steps that have to fall in just the right manner in order for person to go from fertilized egg to a person. And yes, hand wavium is very handy, but I'm just saying, don't immediately go to that as a go-to because you don't necessarily understand the science. Because again, it can be a fun experience for learning, and it gives you different ways of thinking and interacting with your stories.
But so there's a question here actually, and it sort of ties into that, this idea that there's genetic mutations and using mutations as a sciencey, magic-y, and hand-wavy powers kind of thing. And I think there's sort of, scientists are really comfortable with the fact that we don't know everything, right? And in fact, that's where we are most comfortable, is kind of on the edge of where we know things, right? Like that's where we like to be. We like to know what the next big thing is going to be, and the next thing that we can kind of know is. So we spend a lot of time thinking like, what don't we know? And can we know it? And then working that way. But it's a slow process. And I think, a lot of what we had these aha moments where we go, oh, isn't this cool? We figured out why this is. But we spend a lot of times observing what it is we don't know, and the processes that we don't know. So I think, you know, scientists are much more comfortable with not explaining everything because you can't, right? There's things that we understand very well, but there are still limits to how we put those together. You know, one of the things we spend a lot of time observing stuff and then going, okay, well, why? And why do we see that? And sometimes we don't have the ability, we don't know enough, we don't have the things that we need to know to actually know why. You know, genetics is a great example. You know, sequencing genomes is really pretty new, and we still can't do it all. We still don't know how it all fits together. We still don't know, you know, how these things regulate themselves, or you know, we don't know everything. We know a lot. We know a lot more than we did 10 years ago or 20 years ago or 30 years ago, but we still don't know everything, right? There is a bit of like, well, one of those things, like when I study horizontal gene transfer, when we talk about how the genes actually, one of the big questions is, well, how do those genes actually get into the genome and how are they functional? And we have some ideas, but we don't know every time. We don't know why, right? We don't know how. We have some ideas for it, but we're still working on those pieces. So, you know, I think sometimes, a lot of times in science fiction too, is you spend so much time. Oh my God, there's times you're just like, oh, just stop trying to explain it. Especially when it's something that you know a lot, like as a scientist, you know a lot about it, and you're like, just go with it, man. Like, don't spend the next chapter trying to explain every bit of this minutia of how this thing happened. Like just go, man. Like you fleshed it out enough. Like, because you're not gonna do it well. Like, it's gonna get boring, and you're gonna just wait on your plot, and you're gonna it's just gonna go bad, right? Like, so there's a certain time when it's better just to kind of go over it and be like, yeah, that happened, and it's close enough, and it's good enough, and you know, but we don't always know why. And we're okay. I think scientists are pretty comfortable with kind of going like, here's the edge of where we are, right? And the next, getting past that edge is more work. It's a different project, it's a different study, it's a different thing, it's somebody else's work, it's not my field or whatever. Like that's usually where we sort of go, yeah, that's the end.
Kind of knowing where we are now, kind of super magical powers through genetic transformation of humans is a little kind of tricky, you know. Just even, you know, curing simple diseases, we still struggle with that, right? You know, people have been dreaming of being able to cure genetic diseases through some gene modification and so on. So
and we just got to the modification part with CRISPR, and that's throwing up a whole bunch of things, you know.
So, but you know, if that aspect is not too critical, you can kind of fast forward it without getting too much into the explanation and the details, because, you know, if the most important part is what happens next, that's you know, that might be where you want to focus. You know, talking about sort of genetic modifications and so on, for me, one of the cult movies, again, a sci-fi movie, is Gattaca. So
Gattaca, yes.
Gattaca is kind of very interesting in that it's happening somewhere in the future, but the imagery and the fashion, a lot of things are also retro a little bit, that almost kind of are inspired, come from the 1950s-ish, you know, the way that the environment looks and so on. And it's really a story really I love, because this idea that we could sort of be genetically manipulated, selected, and so on, is kind of getting real. It doesn't happen in real, but it's really something I can envision. I don't know exactly what scientific detail goes in it, but it's something I can really see happen in a few years from now. And really where they run with that is, you know, they create a world where those that have been selected and so on are sort of the normal people, and then there's the privileged and so on, and then there's those who have not been modified but were just simply naturally conceived, who might still have, you know, at least on paper, all the risks for, you know, all the diseases, or not as much intelligent and this and that. And so, you know, that's actually, you know, one great movie that makes that leap too.
Right. And I think if you take away anything from this discussion, remember that science can also inform the human condition, like Dr. Eiley pointed out with Gattaca. When we talk about altered carbon, when we talk about the arrival, science is the means by which we understand our world in the broader sense. So even thinking about science as a means to those things, you still get back to those things in stories in terms of themes, people, their personalities, the people they interact with, the spaces they interact with. It's still all about human stories. Because, in a way, science are stories that just happen to be backed up by facts most of the time. So, because even when we write papers, there is a thread of a story that we are telling in terms of talking about our work and our research, because we tell people what we did, we tell them how we did it, we tell them why we want to do what we did, what led us to do these experiments, and how do they fit in the grand scheme of things, all the way down to talking about how do we, what conclusions can we come to from the things that we did. So science in its own form is a type of storytelling. It's just more likely to be done in terms of numbers and straight talk, as opposed to being wrapped into necessarily the human condition.
We're just not as good at it.
Yeah, that one.
But no, and then also there's this thing. So I have young kids, so they're always asking me hard questions. It was like, Mom, how do you make a magnet? And I was like, oh God, like I know that it involves, like I couldn't remember off the top of my head. It came out of the blue. So I think one thing that showed me is we all use science and technology and consume it all the time with a very minimal amount of understanding of how it actually works. And we're very okay with that. Like, I don't have to, if I turn on the television, I don't have to explain all of the things that make the television work in order for you to believe that I turned on the TV. Right. Mm-hmm. So so it's kind of that, like putting all the pieces, like I can make a magnet work really well, and I don't have to understand how they take a thing and make a magnet, right? I understand. I can.
Yeah, positive ions and negative ions and poles and all of that. Yeah. I'll let you handle that.
Right, exactly. Right. Like, so, there's a certain amount of, like, it's good to understand these things. And it's important, but you can create and do things that are wonderful, and live your whole life without really having to, in immense detail, understand how things go. And again, we are, as humans, very comfortable with that. Sometimes, none other times not.
Not all the time, but yeah, for a lot of things we are comfortable with not understanding. But I think science as a tool, whether it's to build out your stories or even to inform your story, it requires understanding science as a process. And I think that's when most people get tripped up when utilizing science in their stories, is because they think of science as something that has to be completely facts and numbers and detailed explanations, when no, it's human curiosity, it's human innovation, it's human even daring, because we went from the monk, noticing that the peas are different depending on what flowers were pollinated, and we get Mendelian genetics, which still in certain genetic instances and cases is still a very solid theory on how genetics and genetic change and diversity works. But now, thanks to technology and understanding, we also now understand genetic differentiation down on the gamete level and recombination and all those things which we didn't know before. But again, that's because humans were curious and looking to understand and looking to interact. So you get these fascinating sort of relationships that come from, humans just being humans and doing what humans do. One of the other fun things that I picked up for a science fiction novel that I'm working on is this relationship between honey gliders and some of the African tribes that live near them. They've developed a relationship in which there's a language exchange between humans and these honey gliders, and these honey gliders will guide humans to where honey is. And by guiding them to the honey, the humans will knock the hive down, smoke out the bees, get the honey, and then leave whatever's left for the honey glider to eat. So they have over time developed this partnership in order to find and utilize food and resources within their areas. Who did that first? We don't know. We just know it's literally now a part of their genetic social relationship. Humans and dogs. If you put a wolf cub and a puppy in a room and say a ball gets rolled under the couch, the wolf will still attempt to get it by itself. It'll never turn to ask for help. However, the puppy immediately will sit and look at the human like, hey, yo, help. Because socially, because there's this whole concept of social genetics and social evolution and epigenetics and, local genetic modification, which is a whole thing in itself. But between those behaviors, we're learning that, dogs have basically evolved to basically having this partnership with humans to the point where they are now wired to look to humans for help, as opposed to trying to do it on their own. Even now, one of the more fascinating things that I've been watching is language and human-animal language discussions, because of animals like Russell the cat, Billy, Bunny the sheepadoodle, who have these fluent pet buttons that they use to communicate with their owners. And it's blowing a lot of people's minds because they're like, wait, she can understand the concept of time and time passage. She can, be taught, quantity by saying, she wants to go outside and do something else. How does she categorize things like she's eaten? She'll sometimes say bird belly, for example, when she's talking about that she ate. And she's like, yeah, I gave you chicken earlier. So there's so many things from science that can inform just interactions. And a lot of times stories really depend on interactions in order to be really good, whether it's interactions between characters, interactions between the characters and the environment, ideas. So there's so much there, but again, you have to kind of change how you see science when you're working as a writer, if that makes sense. But let's see. Author Goddess, can you tell me time-wise, are we good? Let's see. Question: what are some ways that you have appreciated entertainment media for drawing attention to a field? Are there times that it has created perception problems?
There was a question earlier too on how do you make a dragon's fire breathe a biological feature rather than magical. I think it's kind of easier-ish to answer that one.
True.
I would say, what is fire? Fire, you have a high energy molecule that's burning, right? So I don't know if any animal spits high energy molecules like, butane, any hydrocarbons and so on. It's a little trick here, but there's more of a figurative analogy where you can have an animal spit something that burns, not necessarily fire. And that actually exists biologically, like, venom and so on. That's another way of saying,
Bombardier beetles. Bombardier beetles are really cool because they have two
I was literally typing that in the chat.
They actually shoot out of their butts and they react outside their body, right? So right, and it's caustic, right? So you can mix, but it doesn't mix inside the animal, it mixes outside the animal, and forms a combustive reaction outside the body. So if I were to do it, again, the insect person, I would totally do it the way insect, in some fashion like that. And you also have like luminescence too, which is cool.
Yeah, yes. There's also in How to Tame Your Dragon, their fire breathing is similarly due to gas mixtures, but they have parts of their mouths where they can create sparks. So the gases mix within the animal, but the gases mix in the animal, but by sparking with their tongues, that creates the fire out of their mouths. So that's a more realistic way to look at it as well. Let's see. I think there was another question. Oh yeah, the question about when has the media brought attention to a certain field, or they have created, or are there times that there's created a perception problem? So like I said, Arrival brought a lot of attention to linguistics. Gattaca, brought attention to genetics. And a lot of bio.
Oh, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
I was gonna say, I think a lot of dystopian novels also bring, a lot of attention to climate change, and I think that's a really important one that we're seeing. I mean, we're seeing a lot of dystopian, and we have for a very long time, dystopian novels about the horrors that humans wreak, right? And the climate change that we bring about, and some of those can be really good. That was one of the things. The Southern Reach trilogy was very good on that. Annihilation, thinking about what humans are doing to the environment, and bringing that into a science fiction way.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep. I think whether or not the attention is good or bad, whether something is good or bad is really dependent upon the ideologies that are utilizing it, I feel, because in a movie where the ideology is too much technology and lack of human connection is bad, then it's going to put technology and science at odds with, our idea of what makes us human, versus science can change and open up the world, being a completely different take on. It's kind of like dystopia versus, say, hope punk or something like that. Like, it's what divides, say, diesel punk from solar punk, or cyberpunk from from steampunk or something to that effect. Like, how you utilize the science is going to be informed by how you see science as a tool, if you're using it in that respect. So movies that call attention, so like, for example, X-Men, whenever X-Men show up, people start talking about genetics and mutations and things of that nature. When you have movies like Avatar, you're talking about habitat destruction, ecologies, and those sorts of things. So it really just depends. But a lot of times, the public usually takes away the catastrophe version of it. Like, Planet of the Apes, there was a whole bunch of talks of, oh no, the apes are coming and da 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 da. So, anytime somebody, announces that they've done some new experiment in a primate or some kind, they're immediately going, here comes Planet of the Apes. And it's just kind of like, yeah, it was funny the first, time. And now this is like the seventh. Please stop. Kind of thing. Because even Planet of the Apes, for example, I'm like, we don't have to usher that long. Like, you can see it now. I was just reading oh, bye-bye. I was literally just reading an article that was talking about that chimps are like murdering like gorillas on purpose, and they're using spears and rocks and things. So they're making their way on their own. We don't have to help them, is the point. But since everybody else looks like they're needing to check out and go, thank you so much for listening to us geek out and ramble. And I want to really thank all of the panelists that showed up to, have this discussion with us today. And I really am glad I got a chance to do this, because I definitely have a few video ideas that I want to do now, now that I'm talking about it. But I hope this was able to be informative for you all, and that you got something out of it besides just listening to me ramble. like I said, I'm putting together a list of resources for some of the things that I talked about. And as soon as I get it finished up, I'll put it in the treasure trove for you all to have. Thank you again, Dr. Ailu, for being here. And I hope that you had a good time as well. I'll probably follow up with everybody when it's done. So thank you again for coming, and I hope you have a great day. And everybody else, for the rest of the Writers Conference, I hope you enjoy the rest of the panels that are coming up this afternoon, morning, evening, wherever you may be. And thank you for hanging out with me. And I think we're going to be raiding back over into the Writers Conduit area, right? Author Goddess? Yes. Hi. Yes, please. Hmm. Okay, cool. It is, it is. Yeah. Right, right. Well, if we do have that much time left, Dr. Ayalu, I'm probably sure you have other things you need to do today. I'm more than happy to, stay and be a geek about things, because I know I kind of rushed through my talk earlier just so that people had time to ask questions of the panelists, before they had to leave. But, I can talk all day about the different examples and, science and the way those can interact with stories, or even the way I use them. If people want to hear about them, I could do that too. It's just all down to what you guys want to do, because I mean, you guys are the ones here listening to us talk.
I will have to go and say goodbye.
Bye bye. Thank you again for
Yeah, thanks for the
helping.
invite.
Of course,
This
of
was
course.
a lot of fun.
Yes. Have a good day. Thank you so much. Oh yeah. Oh yeah. Oh, by all means, please do. But yeah, in particularly, one of my goals I'm hoping to at some point is to write a book about writing in science, because there's a lot of books that oh, that's something else I could run through that is really nice. There's a lot of books on certain subjects in writing that people can use. One of them being there's books on like character traits and psychology and things like that for writing, but I haven't really seen much in the way of sciences for the sciences. So I'm looking forward to one day doing that, and kind of helping to put together something of a primer for writers to use on certain common science subjects that might come up in their work. Um, and there was also like another section that I was going to talk about, like different ways of utilizing science, from the hard science to the soft sciences, because you can pretty much find it anywhere. For example, I was saying like mysteries or even romances. I mean, given our day and age with fan fiction and things like that, you have, the florists they use and all of those types of things, which are really good. But, knowing a bit about botany and flower maintenance and care can give, your depth to your florist character besides, hey, we're hanging out in the flower shop. Or learning more about, myths surrounding flowers and other things can also add depth to your stories. But also another good way, like I was saying earlier, science is a school of thought, and the thoughts are usually about, I have a question and or a problem. A question and or a problem. Here's what I think is going on. Here's how I'm going to test what's going on. Here's the observations I made. And then here are my conclusions based on these observations I've made. And people do it on a regular basis. It's just people don't realize that they're doing it because it's an automatic process of how we navigate our environments. So when you think about it that way, even, building on a character, for example, becomes a bit more of a thought exercise than necessarily a hard and fast rule. It's okay, so what's the conflict, the problem, or even the character trait, okay, here's what I think it is, or what I think the character needs, or even what the character thinks they need, for example. And so here's how they go about getting it. Here are the results that they got from trying to get it. Here's probably the conclusion they draw, and then it might be back to the drawing board. But again, there you are. You've got your question, your hypothesis, your experiment, your observations, your results, your conclusions, and you go back again. Just like, and that can give you a rising and falling action when it comes to a character. If you're looking, like I was saying earlier, when it comes to world building, understanding geography and the ecology of things like rivers versus lakes versus tundras versus, boreal forests can give you a lot of different conflicts and or things to think about in terms of building your world or the conflicts for your characters. For example, in the novel that I'm working on, the main point of the novel is that they're trying to get across this planet before the last ship leaves. Which, is pretty simple, cut and dry, but their main obstacle is the environments are harsh. The planet that I chose, Galicia Beta, is actually a planet that has a very weird season cycle in that it's either all light or it's all dark in various periods of their calendar solar year. So it means that during the day cycle, there are different animals, there are different interactions, and there are different things that they're able to do, including agriculture, fishing, things like that. Whereas when they can go into a night cycle, they're looking more at eating things that they preserve, those things that they've managed to pull in from agriculture and things like that. And like the only food sources really left, more or less, might be what's roaming around in the dark. But you also have different types of predators that roam around in the dark, that have different hunting strategies, that have different feeding strategies and needs, which means the obstacles you're going to face during the day cycle are going to be completely different from the ones in the night cycle. And that's just from understanding how the planet I'm using as a model works in terms of the ecology based on the weather and nature of the planet itself. But that's already informed a whole bunch of things about my world and story, because of the way the cycles work, and they could be in it for years. So their cultures have developed around those limitations. For example, so like that's one way that you can utilize science in the way that I did. Or you've got stories that may revolve around microcosms. I mentioned Patricia Collins before. She actually wrote Outbreak, which the movie was based on. She's also wrote a bunch of other books about the medical examiner character and the different cases she has to solve. And when you're reading the book, she's methodically going through, okay, this person was, for say, a diver, did he die from the bends, or was he poisoned, or did something else happen? And you need all those kind of scientific backgrounds and things in order to make this a believable thought pattern and drive where the mystery puts her and who she interacts with in order to finish solving it. So it can be small or large. Right. Exactly. Same. Same. Yep. Yep. Mm-hmm. Yep. 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 Mm-hmm. Yep. Like I said when I was talking about Avatar, like I said, I rushed it a little bit, but like Avatar: The World Last Airbender, literally from the bottom up, is built around the science of bending, which we can equate to, some of our, physics and things like that. But like in the Earth Kingdom, for example, they're building their homes more out of rock and sand and things like that. And you're like, oh yeah, of course, they're earthbenders. But the way they build them are very similar to Pueblo cities that you see in the cliff faces, in places like New Mexico and other places where people were living out in the desert areas that are very similar. Right, right, exactly. And then you also, if you like pay attention to the stuff going on in the background, how they plant their food was based on sort of like those sort of step gardening techniques on these different layers. And then you had people moving like containers and carts using earth bending. So they were on wheels and things like that, but instead of, having to physically push it, they use their bending to push it, but the same physical concepts are there, versus the Fire Nation using metal, versus water tribes being nomadic and, sailing around on boats and fishing and all of those things, because again, it's dictated by their environment and the bending that exists for those environments. So it's from the top down in characters, like with Toph, and even with like Katara, she had to learn hers from scratch because she was the first bender born in her tribe and generations. So she was learning from scratch, and how she learned versus how others were learn their craft and were taught can cause conflict or tension, because they're having to work against each other. And then coming to finding out, instinct works better for her because of how she thinks about and works with water versus, say, knowing a specific martial arts style. Even when building Avatar, they based the different bending techniques on the different types of martial arts that fit with those bendings. So you've got like Tai Chi for water. I know Tai Chi for water because I studied Tai Chi for a bit. I forget all of the different forms that go the other three, but each one was based on a specific type of martial arts. So their movements were different there, but it fit to what they were doing. The belief systems, like the ideology, because the idea of the Fire Nation being more important than the other elements, and order being maintained by them, those sorts of things. Like it builds from there, and because of the environment, and oftentimes the environment dictates the belief systems. Like, for example, you get a lot of stories about gods and having to appease gods because nature does its nature thing. But when you don't have the words to describe that nature doing nature thing, you get instead the god of rain is angry today. Of course, now we know. Right, exactly. So like, but now of course we know the rain cycle, the water cycle, and how all of that works. But when we didn't, that was our science, that was our way of explaining how the world around us worked. And we a lot of times brought all of this information. We oftentimes got a lot of this information through telling stories. So, science and storytelling for me in that sense goes hand in hand, because you can continue to work those types of thought processes into your work without having to necessarily even be sci-fi. Like I said, it can just be background information, or even something that you just keep in the back of your mind to inform how you're going to write something. For example, most of my published work is in fan fiction because, like I said, I'm working on my own things. But in one of my fan fictions for Psychonauts, I actually went back and extrapolated the information we had from canon to include a sort of what's it called? Yeah, the the panspermia idea that a extraterrestrial bacteria had come from space on the specific rock and landed on Earth, and because of its proliferation symbiotically, it helped people and animals develop psychic abilities. And through making this sort of inference, it changes how certain people see the utilization of psychic abilities, because you've got people who understand that technically this is just an evolutionary by process. This is not really that big of a deal. It's just kind of evolution. It's going to be that way regardless, versus those who don't necessarily know that information or understand it can fear it or blame it on otherworldly forces or just general weirdness, just in the same way that we do everything else. So again, utilizing science in order to inform views of characters and then pitting those conflicting views against each other is a great way to spark tension. Oh, no, yeah. Any real scientist worth their salt will go, nothing is definite. A lot of things are contextual. Like, one of my biggest pet peeves when people talk about evolution is survival of the fittest, yada, yada, yada. And I'm like, it's not the survival of the when people say survival of the fittest, usually what most people are missing is the context in which that was said. The context in which that was said was the survival of the fittest for that environment. Because, for example, there are, fish and animals that live in caves that are blind because they put their resources, instead of putting them towards photosensing eyes, which they can't really use because they're in caves, they shunt it to other senses that they can use to utilize, to better utilize their resources. They shunt them to other senses and things in order to be efficient. Now, if you take a blind cave fish and put them in a river, yeah, they're going to probably suffer to an extent because they're blind. They're not fit for that environment. You put them in a cave, they're going to out eat the fish that rely on, sight to see. So of course, it's about the environment, or, the very classic, what's the point of asking a monkey to swim or a fish to climb a tree? But most people don't get that far when they think about it. So then they're like, oh, well, they evolved to do X, Y, and Z. And you will ask them, well, why? Why did you evolve them to do this? This makes no sense. Well, I thought it would, I thought it would be cool. I'm like, really cool is always great, but how does this fit with what your narrative is going for? and that's where they trip. So instead of going, okay, what's the logical, what are the steps logically that they would evolve, it gives you the ability to be more creative with your creatures as well as your ecology and as well as your story, because now you're going to think, okay, if this is the creature I want to create, what's the situation that will create it? Because you work backwards. What's the situation that's going to create it? And then you create it, and then while you're doing that, you can discover a story or something else cool while you're doing so. Mm-hmm. Yep. Exactly. Yes. Yes. Yep. Yep, there would be sitting ducks. Moose have that problem now. Their horns will get locked and they will just sit there and starve, or a predator will come along and eat them, things like that. Yep. So yeah, right, exactly. So like you brought up a good point, like how evolution works. Now, yes, there is mutations on the individual level, but evolution actually proceeds on the population level. And that's something else that people tend to miss. So yes, there, like your point was, the individual mutated, but there's no point in there being a mutation because the one that had the mutation died out because it stepped in a hole. But also on the individual level and social level as well, there are some, we've recently in the last like decade or so have been really studying gene expression, and we found that on the micro level, gene expression changes according to environment, and that there's a such thing as a genetic memory of environment. And that epigenetic, yeah, epigenetics is the field, and we are seeing that changes in environment, if there's stress in an environment, brain function is different, brain formation is different, thanks to cortisol and all of those hormones that control all those things. They can change within the mother and be passed on to the child. There's even some people that are, studying it in humans in terms of why there might be some medical differences between cultures. I hate saying races in terms of genetics, but because not really, but but because it's more stuff. Yeah, yes but no, but yes but no, because it's more about the environment versus the races. It's your environment's more going to influence that than say whether you're quote unquote black or not. Because I mean, it's all based on the same thing. It's melanin, it's melanin content really. But again, that's influenced by environment. We have darker skin because most of us were living closer to the equator in hotter areas. So we needed it to protect from the sun versus those that eventually dispersed out to colder areas where the sunlight was less harsh. So of course they lost, some of it because they weren't getting the benefit. Right. Right. Well, but again, what would actually, but see, again, that leads to the question of, mm, Yeah, but again, though, so like again, story concept here. If we're going on, so like an example of how I would take that apart. If we're going, okay, we're using height as a social construct, as a quote unquote race marker. How will we determine what is a concrete cutoff height for creating a sort of category or caste system? Are we talking short, medium, tall? So I'm just kind of spitballing here as I'm thinking through it. So okay, first you're gonna have to think about what's the categorization. Height is a bit of a weird one because it's more of a continuum than necessarily something that can, immediately see a dichotomy between. Yep. Yeah, like there's a whole right, exactly. And but the other thing that you would have to think about would be, okay, socially you're right, there's that if short people were the richest class, but again, what would facilitate that in the environment? Because again, in the environment, what facilitates that is that due to the fact that most of our food supply or whatever is really high up. Or like, let's say, even taking out of a human context, let's say you got an alien species and they need to feed. So, is it more likely that the taller people are going to be more likely to be able to reach the food source? Or is it that taller is worse because their blood pressure is really terrible because their bodies are not built to be able to be like, for example, my cousin, he's literally a tall willowy thing, but he's prone to like having moments of fainting because he's so tall and his body doesn't necessarily handle the amount of strenuous activity because he's so tall, and his heart can't necessarily pump hard enough to circulate in such a tall body. It's why giraffes are built the way they're built. They're built with these venous blockages so that they can control blood flow to their heads whenever they bend their heads down so they don't explode them, for example. Right. So again, maybe taller is not good because, due to atmospheric pressure, maybe, they don't get enough oxygen in their blood, so they're more likely to die off. But a shorter person, might fit the gravity and the atmospheric profile better. So again, we don't necessarily know. But there's way, like I said, thinking about problems like that way, it gives you good ideas for story fodder when you think about it. Because again, science is a thought process. Just as much as they are concrete rules and information and observation, it's a thought process. So utilizing it in that way is also a very good writing tool as well. It's cause and effect. Oh. Ah. Well, I mean, it would also depend on what other markers are being considered markers of adults. Because for humans, for example, technically, even though it's not supposed to be considered a marker of adults, a lot of people mark adults as, having reproductive, obvious reproductive organs. So for girls, it's, development of breasts, hips, etc. Men, enlargement, yeah, men, the enlargement of the penis and, changes in musculature, usually in the chest area, those sorts of things are noted. But it's interesting you bring up, sexual attraction. One of the other weird drivers of evolution, because most people think about, the whole survival of the fittest, but another thing that drives evolution are selection pressures. And usually people think of environmental pressures in selection. But they don't often think of sexual selection pressures. So what is sexual selection? Sexual selection basically says it's the use of a sex characteristic that is bred into a population due to a preference of a sexual nature that leads them to be more attractive to more mates, meaning that that trait will stick around even if it's counterproductive. The most popular example to use is coloration of feathers in birds. 9 times out of 10, you're going to find the dimorphic bird species. And when I say dimorphic, that means that the male and female look different from one another through various characteristics. So right, exactly. Males have brightly colored feathers, bird song, and dances and all these things that can make them really obvious for predators. But because females find them more attractive, they're likely to mate more than those that are not. Whereas due to environmental pressures, females are more likely to blend into their surroundings. And that's due to the different sexual, and when I say sexual, I'm meaning this in the more technical term in terms of reproduction. For them, their sexual concerns are mainly, how can my children survive? How can I survive long enough to have kids? For males, it's how many kids can I father? So their pressure is exerted by females. Well, that's of course if females have choice in this situation, because that also plays a role. Which gender is the choosier gender? Well, but animals do have free will to an extent. It's just how do we measure what that is? But that's more of a science philosophical question. But I was more explaining sexual selection because that's where you get these overpronounced displays and feathers from and things like that, because they're looking. Yes, peacocks are a prime example. So when you're talking about evolution and evolutionary development, sexual selection is one of them, and one of the concepts is runaway sexual selection, where the trait is pretty much at this point almost disadvantageous, but because of sexual preference, you get a trait that is over exaggerated because of that fact. So like, for example, peacocks, male peacocks have these huge tails. They can barely fly. They stick out like sore thumbs. They're, easy pickings for certain predators, versus peahens who have much shorter feathers. They fly farther and they're more likely to blend into their surroundings. Because again, the female has to stay alive to fertilize the eggs, sit on the eggs, and hatch the children. The guy just needs to, supply the DNA at this point. So, if they eventually get eaten, it doesn't really matter if they've already reproduced. but yeah, so when you're thinking about things like that, keeping those sorts of concepts, learning about those sorts of concepts will actually inform how you think about those types of things much faster. So when you brought up attraction, that is one of those things. There are so many experiments that have shown that, like, if a scientist, changes an attribute of a male and, gets a pair to breed and things like that, after a couple of generations, you will have programmed the females in order to be attracted to those particular traits, no matter how ridiculous they are. Like Yep. Exactly. It's those types of things when you think about stuff like that. And also, sexual selection will also have an impact on environment as well, because that's going to inform things like predation, habitat space, habitat availability, because like we're losing a lot of animals to habitat loss. We're in or like perfect example, the reintroduction of wolves to Yellowstone. When the wolves were reintroduced to Yellowstone, it impacted things so far to the fact that the rivers literally altered because of their reintroduction. Yep. Exactly. So like when you familiarize yourself with, even like I said, the simplest of things like the scientific method, you can really change how you look at your story and how you think about your characters and your plot and your world building and how all of that fits together. And then of course with knowledge of some further concepts like epigenetics, sexual selection, environmental selection versus, environmental selection, you can get these situations where you can use height as a sort of caste or system marker and, breed out that continuum, because then that's also a question. If you put emphasis on height, how does that change your population genetics, over time? Because I mean, we even see it here today, because places on earth, you have all kinds of different criteria for attraction. We're not going to get into the whole, European standards, yada yada yada. We could be here all day. But if you look around the world, what's considered, desirable height, heights, facial features, traits, are all not only dictated by biology, but also dictated by preference. Another area that's becoming a big problem: dogs. Yes, we all love pugs. We all love their squish faces, but the poor things can't breathe. Please stop. Yeah, but because we're looking for the aesthetic as opposed to, will they have a good quality of life? Even in some of the other breeds, like German Shepherds, for example, they are working to breed more working morphs of German Shepherds in order to decrease the diseases in the breed lines, like hips dysplasia and humpback and that sort of thing. But again, it became a thing because we put emphasis on the physical attributes and the look of the dog as opposed to the health and maintenance of the dog. So there's all these unusual mutations of dogs because humans exaggerated traits based on the looks and not necessarily the function, whereas nature tends to favor the function over the looks, as long as it got the job done. So that's another way in which, those types of concepts come into play that you can definitely play with, especially if you're into, like, we've had our furry panel the other day. When you're looking at furries and writing about furries and you want to look at how those worlds will be influenced, again, pay attention to those things. Zootopia did this in a really interesting way when you looked at the way their city was built. It was built to accommodate different sizes of different animals and nutritional needs and things like that. So you can use those to inform your decisions and the way your characters behave, different attributes or behaviors and things like that. So yeah, I know certain people have, aversions to furries because weird, but there's really some fascinating ways of looking at anatomy and physiology, and even things like morph types and things like that. So when I say morph types, I mean like phenotypes, what are, code colors, functions, how they functions, why do they have them, as well as, it can give you some good ideas. Like I always blow people's minds when I tell them, if you put us under UV light, technically women have stripes, and they're like, what? Yeah, women have stripes because we have XX chromosomes. And depending on the type of chromosome, you will have different things functional at different points in your body simultaneously. Meaning one X might be, expressed in this particular area, another one might be expressed in this area, and they might alternate. So under the right lighting conditions, you've got women that glow in stripes. Are all the stripe patterns the same? So like suddenly you have a alien race that don't have fingerprints, but they've got stripe patterns. Like you can do so much with it, but you just have to learn how to utilize it as a proper tool. Yep. Yeah. Yeah, and it also requires, I think the thing about genetics to phenotype is you also have to understand a bunch of different other sciences and concepts along the way for it to make sense. Like, for example, you mentioned the eye color. Well, eye color is pretty technically considered pretty simple. It's basically the proteins that are found in feathers and fur and hair, and because of the way the light hits them and how our eyes perceive light, we are seeing them as blue, green, or brown, or whatever, what have you. And that can easily change. For example, if you're colorblind, are you yellow blue colorblind, you're going to see something else. If you're red blue color, if you're red green colorblind, you're going to see a different set of colors. If you don't see color at all, you're not going to see, if somehow you have a really rare complete color blindness, you're not going to see, any color, other than monochromatic. So it's all there. How you get from A to B for a lot of things are there. But you'd have to understand a whole bunch of other concepts before you can understand that genetically this says you're probably going to have blue eyes, to why we actually see blue eyes. Oh, yeah, heterochromia is that's phenotypic expression, but yeah. Chimerism, yes. Yep. Exactly. Exactly. And like the more you know about how all of those little things come together, you begin to wonder more and more, how did we survive? Because like even just talking about something as simple as getting from something as simple as, for example, what we consider the norm, which is basically cis heterosexual person, sex, sex, gender, along with sex and gender. In order to get through that, there are 4 whole levels of development that you have to go through to get it to develop right. Hormonally, your body has to match your assigned sex. Your physical traits have to match your assigned sex. Your actual brain has to match your assigned sex. Like it all has to line up just so for you to be born, quote unquote, normal. Because for example, brain scans have shown that people that are trans literally have similar brain patterns and shapes to the gender they think they are. Whoops, rephrase, to the gender they are versus the gender they are born as. Thank you. Yes. Sorry, because I botched that completely. My apologies. That is not what I meant. Right. And so like because like for example, one of my favorite branches of science is endocrinology. It's the study of hormones and how they interact. Because it's mind-boggling to me that this little teeny tiny protein, a hormone that I cannot see with my naked eye, completely dictates how my body functions. Because the way the genetics works is genetics code the proteins, depending on what the proteins are built for, build these different things or control these different processes. In terms of hormones dictate how the body functions and what signals are being given off. And so you can go from top to bottom and hormones are there in some form or fashion. So you can easily have, for example, a blood-brain barrier issue where during development, important hormones might be locked out due to the blood-brain barrier, which causes completely different brain development. The reason we found out about sex hormones in the first place is literally because they cut the testes off of chickens and saw what happened to them, and suddenly turns out, if you remove the testosterone source in a male chick, it will develop into a female, chick physiologically, even though reproductively they are male because they lack those hormones. It's known that estrogen technically masculinizes brains in development. So, for somebody who's like, well, no, estrogens are girls and testosterones are boys, it's like, no, it ain't that simple. You actually. Yes. Right. Exactly. Well, we evolved that because, the evolution of sexual reproduction came from asexual reproduction, and asexual reproduction is considered default female as we understand it in terms of sexual reproduction. So the default is female. And even in some of the older animals, you can see, for example, birds, if you just leave a female alone, they will lay eggs, but the unfertilized eggs will hatch into males. And that's evolutionarily advantageous because if they're in a situation where there are not a lot of males around, these males that are unfertilized can now become male birds and grow up to, mate with other female birds and thus help with increasing the population. So, right, exactly. And then there's so many other ways of sexual differentiation. There's frogs that rely on temperature as well as hormones to determine how they develop into male or female frogs. And there's been clownfish, yes, because they're sex changing fish. Turtles and crocodiles depend on temperature. So the colder it is, the more males you're going to get. The hotter it is, the more females you're going to get. So there's so many different ways that sex can be differentiated. just based on environmental factors alone. So, for a lot of people, they're like, I don't like the uncertainty. And I'm like, yeah, I get it, but I can live with that. you know. But yeah, I think we're 4 minutes from the end. Yeah. Oh, of course, of course. So I am technically Wolfkeeper 99. So a lot of you that are probably hovering around the Twitch Writer Network and Game of Tomes, you probably have seen me or you follow me on here. So, but yeah, I'm pretty much Wolfkeeper 99 everywhere. You can find me socially. I'm on TikTok. I have nothing on my TikTok, by the way, guys. I am working up the courage to post TikToks. So eventually there'll be something right there. But yeah, I'm just kind of hanging out in the wings, saving a bunch of TikToks, constantly cursing myself. But I am also Wolfkeeper99 on Twitter. Whoops, why did I just give my Discord handle? But I mean, that works too. I am on Discord. But I'm Wolfkeeper99 on Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok. There we go. So you'll find me on one of those. I practically live on Discord. Dr. Danielle Lee is Dean Lee 5 on Twitter and pretty much anywhere else you can find her. She's also here on Twitch under the same handle. I will have to get back to you all. I'll put it on the resource sheet when I finish it to get the other socials for the other two if they have them. But yeah, D and Lee you can find pretty much under D and Lee 5 anywhere on social media. She tends to be on Twitter the most though. But yeah, but I'm always hanging around. I'm always happy to answer questions. I'm always happy to answer questions, talk shop, talk ideas. I'm always down to do that. So don't hesitate to, come poke me somewhere. I can't guarantee you I will see it right away because I am a busy person. I also do community management for a company, for an organization called Black Girl Gamers. So if I'm not doing that, I'm at work or working on my own stuff. So if I don't see it right away, don't be upset. I promise I will, get back to you. You can also email me at Wolfkeeper99 as well. I do have a Wolfkeeper Gmail account as well if you want to email me there. You can definitely do that. And if you like fan fiction, I do write on AO3 under the same name there. But yeah, thank you so much for hanging out with me today and listening to me ramble on about science and all kinds of other random stuff. But if you have any more questions or anything like that, like I said, you feel free to poke me. I may not know the answer, but I might know somebody that does. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much, Sable. It is so exciting to be here as a part of Writers Conduit, and especially to participate in believable world building.
If some of this is if you guys have questions or I'm going too fast, please let me know. I tend to talk very quickly.
What made you want to write for kids? This is kind of an icebreaker.
So today what we're going to be covering is we're going to be talking about who can critique and kind of what are the different types of critiquers who are in the world around us.
So, for example, this is Pelagia, homeworld of the Sky Rays.
I've been doing creative writing workshops here where I live for a long time. It's always been this kind of format where you set a timer, write whatever they prompt them, go around, open mic, and just kind of read what we wrote.
So we're talking about cover art today. Cover art can attract readers or repel them as much as we like to think people